We just made for the first minute or so.
And we're live.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of 1,000 stories, and we'll tell a few more this evening. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty mighty Twitter at Coalition_Radio, and of course these and all other shows will live in perpetuity on our YouTube page, which can be linked easily from the top of our home page. The mothership, coalitionradio.us, where several years later you can still read the state police report on Mayor Alan Fung's perfidies, outrages regarding, of course, the Cranston Police Department. Been a busy show, but just a quick minute or so, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, congratulations to Pat Morgan for unanimously receiving the endorsement of the quietly powerful Republican Liberty Caucus. Kind of a telling moment, if you will, in Rhode Island Republican politics. Is there a shift? Is the torch about to be passed in terms of the gubernatorial race? Is there a not so subtle undercurrent in Rhode Island Republican politics favoring Ms. Patricia Morgan, House Minority Leader? And why is that? Personality? Reputation? Clearly eliciting a conservative message as opposed to the mixed message Alan Fung does? Inquiring minds want to know. And if you haven't seen it yet, please go to golocalprov.com. We'll mention this a couple times in this show. A stunning video of your mayor, Mayor Elorza, and what is truly a metaphor for Rhode Island. We'll leave it to you, but no one's going to be playing the tune Skater Boy at any of his campaign rallies anytime soon. So please go to Go Local Prov. You'll see the link right on the front page. Mayor Elorza, probably not one of his finer moments. But let's get right down to tonight's show. We're going to be almost exclusively in studio tonight. Joining me is someone that we lovingly refer to as a repeat offender. He's joined us in the past, and we hope to make him a regular member here of the Coalition. Of course, I'm talking about Nicholas Oliver. I always got to get the title right. You are with the Rhode Island Partners for Home Care, Partnership for Home Care.
Correct.
Here in the state of Rhode Island. And you also got a newly appointed position in the firmament, the stars, the heavens, of course, of county government, aka East Providence. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But this week in front of the state legislature was a bill that in so many ways typifies the sausage making that goes on Halitosis Hall. Let me see if I can read this properly. A new campaign launched to enhance independence and choice in Rhode Island's home care system. So that sounds great.
I'm happy you're laughing.
I mean, what could be better? Choice. Explain, though, if you will, and you know, political action committees, all sorts of organizations. Now I believe actually there's a course in graduate school or in Masters of Public Administration programs on how to pick out euphemisms to structure your name to make it sound as innocuous as possible, when lurking not even so far beneath the surface is an economic bomb that's headed your way. But yet, if you, as the casual voter, perhaps someone who's not immersed in the bubble or in the inner sanctums of day-to-day roadie politics, you would look at this and say, I'm for choice. So give us a little background. First of all, as always, I want you to reintroduce your organization. You've joined us before. You've talked about the organization before. But kind of use as a backdrop what your organization's involved in, your personal involvement on a day-to-day basis. And then, if we can, kind of use the bill as a counterpoint for everything that's really wrong with special interests here in Rhode Island.
Sure. Well, first of all, since he handed me a sugar-sweetened beverage, cheers, my friend, Rhode Island's great yacht club soda. So thank you. So the Rhode Island Partnership for Home Care is the association for licensed home care, home health, and hospice providers. They're licensed by the health department to deliver health care services in the homes of Rhode Island's chronically and terminally ill, those children and adults that are also disabled, receiving personal care. So the title of the campaign for Union-Led Initiative is not indicative of the truth. it talks about choice. But when you talk about choice, you talk about transparency of the quality of the product and being able to make a decision as to what types of services that you're looking for and is the service going to meet your needs. In this case here, what is proposed is a competing home care system that is more costly to taxpayers than the current system that is heavily regulated to ensure that our most vulnerable population that needs services in the most intimate healthcare setting, their home, that they receive quality care, but that they also receive care that is safe, reputable, and reliable.
Right.
So what this does is that instead of taking the traditional model in which we have my licensed home care agencies send out a nurse assistant to provide support for activities of daily living, bathing, feeding, toileting, etc., and have that person who's a licensed nurse assistant, licensed by the health department, 120 hours of training, practical examination, written examination, national background check, proving that they can provide this level of care, and then receive 12 hours of continuing ed a year. You know that that person is safe to go into your vulnerable loved one's home.
Right.
Particularly when you talk about the elderly too, where in many cases, my members' CNAs may be the only person that they see over the course of a week. Right. So you want to make sure that if you don't see your loved one on a regular basis and they use home care, that the person coming into their home is someone who's safe and reliable.
Right.
What the alternative is that the state would create this registry of folks that are interested in delivering the same set of services that the Department of Health licenses for personal care services in the home, and says, we'll give you 3 hours of training because they believe that 3 hours is enough to be able to set somebody on their way versus 120 hours and no continuing ed. Only a state background check, not a national. We don't know if these folks are reliable. And in the end, they could even be competing with the same labor pool that we receive in order to deliver these services in home care, nursing homes, adult daycare, assisted living, even hospitals. So if that's the case, then our facilities and our home care may not even meet our census if our staff are saying, I'm gonna give up keeping my license, or I'm not gonna encourage my friend who needs a job to go up for their license. We'll go do this again on the side because this is easier.
Right.
I don't have to meet the requirements. I don't have to meet safety. Health department isn't going to look over it and see what we do. And yeah, you're going to hire these folks on good faith that they may or may not provide care, but who knows? And in other states that have it, and there's a handful of states, there's rampant fraud, abuse, harm, neglect. And Rhode Island's saying, sure, let's consider signing up for it. It's a scary environment.
So what's the motivation here? Now, it's, as always, you've got to follow the money.
Sure.
I believe you mentioned something about mandatory unionization.
So with this model as proposed, that once they have developed the registry, that these workers will have the right to unionize themselves. And in the other states, there's a union that has heavily pushed to unionize these folks. They're able, under the law, to be able to get a copy of the list of those that are seeking to be these independent providers, or IPs, and subsequently organize them and directly negotiate through collective bargaining with the state of Rhode Island.
Now, in the Kuchera administration, were there a number of attempts at unionizing home health care workers, and there was a lot of chaos at that point surrounding that?
Well, during the Kuchera administration, there wasn't any specific organized activity to unionize this workforce. Instead, they were trying to figure out how to capture a new wave of federal dollars in order to provide for alternative opportunities and new ways of managing the long-term service and support population. So it was called the Global Waiver. It's since been referred to what is codified in CMS rules, the 1115 waiver. And Rhode Island is one of, I believe, 30 states that have this waiver where they can create some exemptions to expand programs and services. So Rhode Island's able to expand above this federal poverty rate in order to capture a larger population that may otherwise be at high risk for nursing homes, to try to keep them safe in homes in the community.
Roughly, how many Rhode Islanders receive care in the home right now, as opposed to having to go to some type of care facility?
So right now, we're about 20,000 Rhode Islanders that receive home care over the course of the year. Now, not all of them are long-term folks, the homebound that are receive our services 365 days a year. That also includes folks that are in interim rehab where they have a surgery and they have been discharged from an acute setting such as a hospital.
Right.
They may have gone directly out of the hospital and back to their home, or they've went to a nursing facility for rehab and then come home for follow-up rehab. And so we provide them that care as well for a temporary period of time until they are back up and able to provide their own activities of daily living without support. But they're targeting the Medicaid population. It's about 3,000 people, and not all of them use daily long-term services and supports, and a little more than half of them utilize managed care services, so they're not directly paid services from the state. Those monies are funneled through our managed care organization, which is Neighborhood Health Plan of Rhode Island.
And I think that's where the average Rhode Islander just gets lost.
Yeah.
Because,
It's complicated.
right, I mean, under the current environment, you're talking about 20+ thousand people. You're talking about a measurable part of the Rhode Island population. You're talking roughly 2 to 3% of the measured population here in the state. That's not at all insignificant for that many people to be under some type of similar, at some point, I would imagine, subsidized care situation.
Well, the Medicaid program is just over a third of the budget for the state. And for this population, we have the highest ratio of 85-year-old and above. And we see it a lot, that folks work here, live here, raise their children all their lives. Rhode Island has become so expensive that their children are just not able to stay, or the jobs are just not here.
Right.
And as folks retire, they leave to go to wherever their children are, or we can never compete with the climate. So folks leave in their disposable income years, and then they get sick and then realize where they flock to warmer weather doesn't have a better healthcare system than they do here in Rhode Island. So they come back. But by the time that they come back, there's not as much availability of resources. So once their assets start to dry up, then they need to utilize Medicaid to be able to supplement for their care.
Right.
I mean, in some cases, we have patients that have lived into their late 80s and 90s, and they tell us all the time, I can't believe I'm still living. I can't believe I've lived this long. I never projected my savings plus what I expected to receive, the little from Social Security, that I would outlive those resources. So now they hit a point where they say, I need to apply for Medicaid, and they're caught in UHIP, and that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But they look at it this way. I paid my taxes all my life. I might have moved away if they did, but even if they didn't, this is their way of getting their investment back, and they're trying to access it.
So the complicating factor here is are we saying that in many cases, the state of Rhode Island essentially becomes a healthcare provider of last resort for this population?
Well, that's what the Medicaid program is to provide insurance for those that may not have it through any other means or meet the minimum eligibility requirements.
But as a layman, and this is, again, why I'm so grateful you came on tonight, because there's so much confusion over this. Why would a state like Rhode Island's benefits be any different than, say, well, Florida? Is it simply homegrown politics?
No, it's actually because of that 1115 waiver that provides the state to be creative and to be able to change policies from the federal standard to allow for new programs to develop or to allow the expansion of eligibility, which is in what many cases our 1115 waiver does.
And which contributes to the staggering growth then of our budget relative to that?
It can, but the whole goal for us is to rebalance our long-term care financing system. It's much more expensive on the taxpayer dollar to have medically fragile or vulnerable populations utilize the nursing homes. If we can stabilize them and keep them in their home and in the community in which they've lived, in many cases, all their lives, then it's far less expensive.
Right.
Because you're not paying the room and board that the taxpayers are paying for a nursing home. We want to be able, my perspective, and I believe the perspective of my providers, is that it's not this home care versus nursing home clash. And sometimes the General Assembly characterizes that we do for the sake of we're all fighting for the same dollars. But in this case here, it's our belief, and certainly my belief, that nursing homes should be preserved for those with the most medical need. Those that there is no way that they can be stabilized at home, be safe, and get the services that they need in order to continue living.
Right.
So short of that emergent level of care, if they can be stabilized at home, we should be dedicating resources to keep them there.
Right.
Make sure that they're quality services, make sure that the oversight is necessary to make sure that people are safe, there's not fraud, waste, or abuse, and have people continue to live in the community in which they love, and the house that they've lived in for most of their lives.
What impact does this bill have on that then?
So again, it all has to do with the quality of care being delivered, the oversight from the health department. The bill encroaches on what is called the scope of practice for a CNA, which means what they're licensed to deliver health care for.
Right.
So, you don't have a nurse that's going to write a script for you unless they're an advanced practicing nurse. That's a physician's responsibility. So you don't want to have a nurse or a nurse assistant performing surgery on you. There's oversight for that. So based on what they can and can't do is considered their scope of practice. So if you are someone who's invested into a career as a nurse assistant or CNA, then you want to make sure that you maintain that integrity and make sure that the person that's coming in is the person that's licensed to provide that care.
Right.
You don't want to have somebody come off of the street that's promised $15 an hour and have 3 hours of training to then help your loved one be able to use the restroom or to be able to eat or to be able to be bathed. You want to make sure that the person coming in is trustworthy, reliable, trained, and is overseen by a healthcare professional. And this proposal doesn't do that.
So what is their motivation? I mean, when you, so much of the legislation that comes out of the building that shall not be named.
I love that you call it halitosis.
All credit to Rudy Cheeks. All right, Philippe Noire. All right.
With all due respect to legislators that I need to go see and ask them for money, but yes.
What's the win for them? Why would you do that? It's just because so many of the people in that building, this is a tribal state, have elderly relatives. If in fact, well, a few of them are almost there themselves.
Yeah, it's very true.
I mean,
it's interesting because I receive phone calls fairly frequently from former elected officials that had the opportunity to help make changes in home care, increase our funding to make sure that we're adequately funded, to then be able to provide competitive wages and benefits for our workforce. These are folks that, again, are delivering care in the most intimate setting. We're not having patients come into our facilities like anywhere else in healthcare. We're coming to you inside your home.
Right.
So, we want to make sure that those folks are adequately funded and adequate oversight. So when there are barriers in getting services, and that's what part of this message of this campaign has been, is that, well, we don't have a workforce to be able to fill all of the cases. Well, it's true. But these former, and I'll tell you why, but these former legislators say, well, how come I can't get services for XYZ loved one? Well, because you had the opportunity to do it while you were there. oh, you're right. I remember you coming up and talking to me each year, time and time again. I should have done something. Well, it's too late for you, but hey, please tell your successor, hey, I need help too. But in the case here of what this campaign is doing is that it's capitalizing on the lack of adequate funding that the legislature has not granted to long-term care providers, especially home care, year after year after year. With the exception of a couple of very small wage pass-throughs over the last two budgets, we haven't seen an increase since FY02. There was an increase for our CNAs in FY08, but most of it got pulled back in the next year because of the downturn in the economy. But our nurses and our professional staff that provide care, particularly to our medically fragile children, which there are hundreds of across the state, they have been asked to work for the same wages since October 1st, 2001. So I tell legislators, I tell members of the media, do you live today on the same salary or wage that you did just after 9/11? The likely answer is absolutely not, nor could you likely live on that salary today. But we, the state of Rhode Island, ask our nurses to live on those wages in the days after 9/11. That's not right. That's 17 years without an increase. So this campaign's capitalizing on that and saying, hey, the traditional home care model doesn't have the capacity, but we can do it this way here. And if you deregulate it, then we'll be able to build the workforce. And yeah, because of UHIP, well, we're going to take advantage of that because that's the state's fault for not correcting it. But we'll provide ourselves a solution. But the problem is that patients may or may not know, or family caregivers may or may not know, that the person that they may hire may not have the national background check, may not have the adequate training, may not have the oversight at all, and that could be at the peril of your loved one.
So now, for example, let's take your very much your prototypical CNA. Very often, and in one of my other lives, I've got a lot of experience with Rhode Island CNAs and some of the economic challenges they face. So who pays for, who typically are they employees of physically?
So they're employees of home care agencies that are licensed by the state to deliver healthcare services in the home. And there are 45 of them in the state. When I became executive director of the partnership 5.5 years ago, there were 86 of them.
Right.
We've seen such a loss in the number of providers in the industry due to lack of quality reimbursement that are able to meet our costs to deliver care. There's a lot more costs than just the wages and benefits to those that deliver care in the home. We have to pay for their workman's comp, their professional liability insurance,
Right.
operating costs, medical supplies and equipment, travel expenses to go between home visits. There's a lot of expenses in order to make sure that the person that's coming to your home is the right person to meet your needs and is qualified to provide that care. So they are employed by these companies, and many of them in Rhode Island, unlike other states throughout the country, are predominantly independent providers. They're small mom and pop businesses who started their companies because they wanted to help their communities and help people who are vulnerable, homebound members of our community to receive the care that they need in order to stay here versus to go into a nursing home, which I believe is absolutely noble, to be able to take your own dollars and to be able to invest them right back into your community. And this proposal says, thank you for that investment, but now we're going to rip that away.
So right now, let's just say XYZ Home Healthcare Agency. Now, first of all, we've lost a few. Those losses, which of course are directly attributed to the UHIP crisis, aren't they?
Absolutely. The last few have, absolutely. Most notably, Homefront Healthcare, which so happened to be in Speaker Mattiello's district. That was the last go-to agency for the Medicaid program, where if they could not find a home care company to provide services, Homefront found a way. So without that safety net, it has made the crisis that much more substantial, because agencies have to be careful to preserve their operations and keep their doors open to continue to pay their employees, which in the end was the demise of Homefront. Their reimbursements were caught up from Medicaid and other payer sources. They had outstanding liabilities, and in the end couldn't make payroll. So, I mean, they operate on such a fragile, if you call it a profit margin, there really isn't profit in delivering health care, certainly not in the home care space. But we just need to be able to maintain our operations, and when an agency can't do that anymore, they close. So if you don't have that safety net anymore, and it's because many of these agencies have been taking on this risk, operating and delivering care in good faith that they'll get reimbursement, but because the governor blames that it's a computer system that's causing the state to not reimburse their care for this care that's been delivered, in some cases months, up to a year, well, now you're turning home care agencies into debt collectors and carrying the debt of the state of Rhode Island. The state of Rhode Island needs to pay their bills and to pay these providers. This home care access crisis is completely artificial and could be resolved tomorrow if our rate setting commission, the General Assembly, stepped up and adequately funded home care providers. Instead of this bill, there's a bill that's been proposed by the House Oversight Chair, Patricia Serpa of West Warwick. Has been an unbelievable advocate for home care. She's a real legislative champion for the elderly and disabled. Her bill is House Bill 7670, and it's to provide for adequate and competitive reimbursement to home care agencies in line with what the reimbursement rates are for Massachusetts and Connecticut, which it's in state dollars, when you're talking about a $9.4 billion budget, to resolve this crisis tomorrow, it's $2 million in state funds. We're able to find a way $10 million to fund for kids to go to college, notable cause to give them an associate degree education. But was that the right time to do that? To cut car taxes? Again, notable cause, we all appreciate savings in the pocket. Was that the right time? Or the bailout for the Paw Sox, which we talked about the last time that I talked about. Instead, why don't we take a little bit of money, a fraction of what all these other programs have been invested for, where they couldn't find the money for home care, but found the money for all these programs, and instead invest them in our community for our most medically fragile people and our vulnerable homebound elderly.
Ultimately, on a dollar for dollar basis, I understand it's a very complex, algebraic, it's algebra on steroids, actually. It's probably calculus. But who physically pays, in terms of the subsidies or the reimbursements, I should say?
Sure.
Who physically pays most of them? Is that, money for the, is that coming from the federal government? Is it coming from the state government, or is it a hodgepodge?
It's a hybrid. It's state funds with the federal match, so it's 50-50. And the money, through the Medicaid program anyway, is reimbursed either through the state, through its Medicaid administrative contractor. This is sort of like the sausage making process of government. But through their Medicaid administrative contractor, which is currently DXC Technology, or they're reimbursed through the managed care organization, which is Neighborhood Health Plan of Rhode Island. Services that are not covered under the Medicaid program, there are several. People can receive services through the Veteran Affairs Aid and Attendance Benefit for military veterans and their surviving spouses. Can be through commercial health insurance, like Blue Cross and Aetna and United. Or it can be through long-term care insurance. Some folks take out those policies to provide care in their twilight years. Or it can be through private pay dollars, which to what we say is should always be the point of last resort, to pull from your pocket directly. More likely than not, there is a payer source, as we call it, that can provide for those services. And if it's not Medicaid or Medicare, it's usually commercial insurance.
Right. So at this point, like most American healthcare, you've got duct tape everywhere, fingers in the dike everywhere. You've got the equivalent of power strips hanging off the ceiling with multiple power cords. You've got this hopeless entanglement. It strikes me that because Rhode Island perhaps is becoming something of a magnet for seasoned citizens, if you will, or the chronically ill. Yet at the same time, Gina seems content to go after Medicaid reimbursements as if there were, there were low-hanging budgetary fruit there. What's the ideal, if you could start from scratch, literally redesign from scratch how to do this, fresh slate, blank chalkboard. After all of your experience, what is the best way to finance home health care? Because we get it. The average person gets it, that it's got to be a whole hell of a lot more cost efficient, plus a quarter degree of dignity that's impossible, even in the finest nursing homes, to keep people at home. But what's the right way to do it?
So your question assumes that the system is broken, and I'm a firm believer that the system's not broken. The system is underfunded. How we have patients be able to receive care through a Medicaid program, which is really the payer of last resort, short of paying out of your pocket. Medicare for certain aged and disabled populations, to be able to provide skilled home care services, so nursing and therapeutic level of services, or now through what we were talking about earlier, this 1115 waiver that allows for those that are both Medicare and Medicaid dual eligible to receive both services and manage through a commercial health insurance company that can better manage this population than a state or federal government entity. So we have the tools and resources in place to be able to provide the best quality of care in the lowest cost setting and in the right environment in which the patient wants to be and can be provided safety and independence. It's just a matter of being able to adequately fund it. And so home care is not just another government-funded program where we're all looking for our handout. The difference is that each of our taxpayers, whether you buy products and services through companies in the state of Rhode Island, you pay your sales tax, or you earn your income through your employer here and you pay your income tax, that you've paid into this system your whole life. Right. And so when you and your loved one need it, and your assets are no longer available, or you've outlived your projected amount of assets, that this is your safety net. And so if you've paid in decades, or your loved one's paid in decades, and your kid is disabled, or it's your elder grandparent or elder parent that's disabled, or needs care, or even yourself one day, you've paid into this system. The state in return has an obligation to make sure that you receive services. And the services that they're obligated to provide should be sustainable, safe, and provide the highest quality of care based on clinical standards recognized by the industry.
I want you to think about this. We're going to take a quick break, but again, as an outsider, what's frustrating to me is that the employees, in my other life, I meet a lot of folks who are CNAs.
Angels on earth. Right. They really are.
The market does not seem to allow them, it can be argued that there's a shortage of trained folks who could do CNAs, who meet
CNAs, nurses, therapists,
right.
Absolutely. Because we need to value caregivers. And I do believe that our communities, people that are our neighbors, our family members, our friends, value caregiving. But our state and federal government does not value it through the dollars in which they expend. Right. There's the difference.
Right, and so you have this crazy situation. At least the market somewhat recognizes the value of registered nurses and pays them accordingly. You've got these folks who are truly the infantrymen, if you will.
Home care, actually.
Yeah.
Our home care nurses are underfunded as well.
Well, and so
17 years without a raise.
I see these folks, and particularly the CNAs, making, and please correct me if I'm wrong, making barely above minimum wage in many cases. Because you've got this broken model where, and to your point, 17 years, the market's not being allowed to, they give them the opportunity for their salaries to grow to the point where it's commensurate with the level of work and the experience they're doing. So it strikes me you've got the worst of the private, you've got the worst of both sides in this situation. You've got the worst of government funding, because government looks to balance its budgets, quite bluntly, on the backs of home health care workers and things like that, because, you know, the money comes in, but again, government, there's the skim. There's always a skim, is there? I mean, I will tell you from personal experience, I have met home health care workers who cannot afford their own transportation.
Scary.
The RIPTR, as we love to say here, fails to meet their schedules
Yeah.
because of the rather unique hours that, you know, that these folks have to work and how many places they have to go.
I hope former Mayor Avedisian is listening.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to a point where it's real human tragedy.
It is.
I have met people who routinely have to take ride-sharing services to get to their $14 or $15 an hour brutally difficult jobs
It is.
and spend 2 to 3 hours of their salary a day getting back and forth to work.
Very true.
That's not anecdotal. That I would have,
No.
I would argue, particularly on the lower end of the home health care work level, you know, in terms of, and again, that's not a shot at that's not a pejorative. That's just that they happen to occupy more of the entry level side, where it's a lot of it is the physical labor as well as caring for people. I would say that the majority of those folks are at a subsistence wage right now,
Yes.
barely getting by. And yet, to your point, these are folks who go into people's homes, occupy, in many cases I've seen firsthand where those home health care aides become a substitute for a family.
Absolutely.
And in the wrong circumstances, to your point, that can be a situation that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, especially as we were talking earlier, that this is a vulnerable population, and our staff may be the only people that they see physically contact over the course of a week.
Right. And I'm talking about the opportunity for physical abuse and or fraud.
Absolutely.
I will tell you, in my other life, I have run into situations where it is clear to me that home health care, you know, people who were not monitored, some of these agencies that parachuted, particularly in Massachusetts, are clearly using that unique relationship what they have with them and engaging in some, you know, there's a commingling there, there's the opportunity for all sorts of devilry, if you will.
Well, and I know, you know, you always got to know who your audience is, and I know that you are a libertarian, and you know, we talk about, in this case here, about being a highly regulated industry. But Rhode Island has, and rightfully so, made sure that there is significant government oversight to make sure that these companies and their staff are the right people in place, that we can, with almost certainty, make sure that they are delivering care and are not going to cause harm, whether purposeful or in intent, or steal from the patient, cause emotional harm, to where it would make that situation not stable. It would not provide safety or level of independence for that client. We have all those safeguards in place, and we support that. And Rhode Island goes the extra step, that instead of like Massachusetts, for example, where you can set up a home care agency tomorrow and start sending people into the home and not have to go through a Department of Health process, here we have something called Certificate of Need. If you want to be a new agency in the state of Rhode Island, you have to demonstrate to the health department that you as a company are financially stable, you will be nationally accredited, and you will have a workforce that will meet the needs of the community. And it's a high bar to get to that point before you can even employ the first person. And then in the past couple of years, the Attorney General submitted a bill to the legislature, and the legislature approved it, that said it's inadequate for Rhode Island, small state, easily accessible borders to other states, that you could have a criminal background in another state and we would never know it. So we're not going to do state BCIs anymore. They're national background checks. And we do that again to make sure that the folks that receive our care are in the safest environment in their home possible.
All right, so here's the dilemma then. We'll get to our station break in a second, but here's the dilemma then. In a very well degree, you've got some very well-meaning and effective safeguards in place that are imposed by a state government in order to provide a high level of care. But at the same time, that state government is chronically incapable of fulfilling their financial responsibility to those same people, resulting in, again, a shortage of providers. You've got, again, high level of high standards. As a libertarian, it's so typical of government to demand, make all these demands on companies. In this case, merited, but
Yeah.
make, well-meaning demands on these companies, and at the same time be completely incapable. I mean, on almost a sophomoric level, and I'm talking, and this is a bad analogy because on one hand, we're talking about people's lives, their long-term health picture, their financial stability, but this idiot's handheld cell phone bill is so typical. There is no place to pull over and use a phone. There is none of the maintenance or rule support of the actual the use of the legislation, but damn it, we're gonna pass a bill.
Right.
So, okay, so you've got this disconnect between funding. Now, for a whole lot of reasons that shouldn't be costing the poorest amongst us, dignity in a high level of health care, the state's broke.
Yeah.
I mean, just arguably broke. Has this governor recognized this crisis on the budgets that she's been involved in? And is the state legislature, I mean, where is the disconnect then? Why aren't these people allowed to make some type of market wage? The challenge, of course, being in a state with a very poor, despite what the governor's claiming, a very poor employment picture.
Right.
Just as an aside, I'd love to see an analysis of the impact of Massachusetts' boom economy and how much that's saving Rhode Island's bacon right now, because all you need to do is be at the intersection of 295 and 95 at 7 o'clock on any weekday and see exactly how many Rhode Islanders are leaving the state every day to go north of Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But what can be done? I mean, and why does this particular bill fail so miserably? Because it strikes me is that you've got this obsession with forced unionization.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this obsession with opening up the jobs to literally someone who it seems like could flock up a mirror. But there's still no financial support of it. What do we do?
Yeah, and with speaking to your earlier point about the governor, there has been 2 small increases in the last 2 budgets, but the main reason for the increase was because the state was moving toward increasing its minimum wage, and what the state was paying to allow for the wages for these CNAs were going to be less than the minimum wage. So the hand was forced to increase these wages. It wasn't a noble effort. It was compliance.
I was gonna say, I've been told that there is a triggering relationship between the minimum wage and what home health care reimbursements are.
Yeah.
I've been told that anecdotally. Is that true?
That's a fair assessment.
Okay.
And at least that's been the trigger to increase the wages in the last 2 budgets, and certainly was the impact in 02 and 08.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of real dollars, when I talk about real dollars, I guess you're using as a baseline 2001. The year before their last quote unquote legitimate pricing.
Actually, it was within the state fiscal year 2002 budget,
Right.
To implement it on October 1st, 01. So,
Okay.
like I said, just days after 9/11.
Right. So in real dollars, and what I mean by that is purchasing value of what they're being paid. Obviously, they've taken a huge hit, and then again, add on to the fact that the state's infrastructure is completely unable to support folks who are working poor.
And you can understand why the folks leave being CNAs. I live in East Providence, and I know you want to get to what's happening in East Providence, but we just had a construction of one of those new, I call them super Cumbies, those Cumberland Farms, the new model.
Yeah.
And they had a sign out there saying, you could earn $13 or more working at Cumbies.
Right.
Mother's hours, benefits, nights and weekends off. Well,
And-
home
and-
care
and-
can't offer that. If you're making $12 an hour and you have to travel in a vehicle that could likely be 10 years or more old, and you get reimbursement for your mileage, but if you're driving an older vehicle, what happens when it snows? What happens when it
Right.
breaks down? You have all of these challenges, plus continuing ed versus the easy fix. That's when folks leave. Now that there's this bill that's offering this quote-unquote easy fix and make more money, you can understand why it's attractive, but it's not something that is attractive to patients that do not know that they're not going to get the same quality of care,
Right.
and that it could be a scary environment, and that them or their family caregivers and loved ones may not know until it's too late. I use this as an example. When you research to get a primary care physician or a dentist, we had to find a dentist for a new dentist for my son recently. And so I call my insurance company and I say, I'm looking for a dentist. Who do you recommend? Well, they're recommending who is within my geography, who's closest to my house. And so a lot of times people pick either who's closest to their house or who's someone that they trust, a friend, a family member, who they go to. But do you research to see what are their quality scores? Have there been any complaints against their license? Is this person a reputable provider? And in some cases, you may not know, because if they have an office that's open and they're licensed, people just trust.
Right.
So that's where the scary problem is with this other bill, because it's consumer beware. The person that you may be getting may, promote themselves as being trained and being prepared to provide you care. I doubt that you can teach home care in 3 hours.
Right.
We need at least 120 per state law. But it provides a scary environment where people won't know until it's too late. And we've seen it in these other states that have it, that have rampant fraud, waste, and abuse on these consumers. And in some cases, it's too late for the patients. And what happens to the taxpayer? In the end, these folks go to a nursing home earlier, and that's at a greater expense to taxpayers. So taxpayers should be aware that this is coming. The Senate has scheduled to pass this on Wednesday. The House is still considering it. If you care about patient safety, and particularly if you're impacted, you have a loved one that receives home care, contact your state representative and contact your state senator and say no to this independent provider initiative. Say no to House Bill 7803 and say no to Senate Bill 2734.
I'm trying still to understand what their rationalization is, because it's not going to save us money.
No, it's going to cost money because it's a competitive system.
Right.
It'll be costly, and it'll erode the quality measures that the state has invested in for decades.
So what's their justification?
That it'll provide access to a workforce to deliver care where folks have been waiting on a waiting list to receive services. Taking advantage of the problems with UHIP that has delayed folks from being able to get services right away. That's not at the fault of home care agencies, that's a fault of the state of Rhode Island, and it's more than just blaming a computer system. Sorry, Governor, have to disagree. But it's that and the inadequate reimbursement, which means the low wages, that we can't compete in the labor pool. So they're capitalizing on this opportunity. And those that are organizing this campaign will eventually financially benefit at the taxpayer dollar, because they will have new membership dues revenue as a result.
Right.
So we're playing politics over patient safety, and that's wrong.
So in this kind of craven desire to boost their union roles, that mixed in with a desire for a short-term fix in terms of personnel, you're going to have some of the most intimate levels of personal Medicare given over to, who knows?
Well, I mean, if you're someone who has problems with corporate welfare, look at this no differently. This is corporate welfare of a different design. And as a taxpayer, you're always saying taxpayers should revolt. This is another example. Taxpayers should revolt, especially when it impacts the quality of care received. This will be lower, deregulated quality health care where it's one-on-one in your home. And if it's not you today, it could be you tomorrow.
And ultimately, when you're dealing with any of these issues medical, there seems to be this suspension of disbelief that someday it's going to be you.
Mm.
You'll get the call, ironically, from the bill sponsors one day, you will,
Yeah.
looking for who's really good that you could send to their wife, or to, God forbid, to their child or to their
Siblings,
Parents.
parents, or even, sometimes themselves. Like I said earlier, I get those calls fairly frequently, and a lot of times it's too late for them to utilize that lesson because they're no longer an
Right.
elected official to make that change.
Right. It's just, until this state recognizes that politics shouldn't be personal, that policy isn't a result of your own personal tragedies, your own personal life situation, I don't know how we break out of this death spiral that we seem to be in.
We deny that we're all aging. I have another birthday this weekend, and I'm coming close to another 0 in my age, and you just reflect and go, oh, I can't believe that
Turning 30 is going to be tough, huh?
Yeah, 30, I wish. I'm older than I look, I guess. But we deny that we get that old or at our age, and then we realize, wow, how did I get to this age? And wow, it went by so fast. And we could blink and, oh gosh, we're 60 and we have a chronic illness. Or we're 80 and we can't get around to what we used to be able to. Or if we're lucky enough or blessed enough, depending on your perspective, if you're 90 and above and go, I can't take care of myself like I used to. It can happen in a blink of an eye,
Mhm.
and then now what?
Where does our much heralded director of Department of Health stand on this legislation? Has she weighed in yet?
Excellent question. And to the frustration of my providers, the Department of Health has been silent, eerily silent on this issue.
So she's out there worrying about OUI crashes.
Mm-hmm.
Can't wait to get up there.
Yeah.
Can't wait to test. She's always willing. Wow, that's. I mean, this is their home turf.
They license and regulate this workforce, these companies. It is at the heart of the Department of Health, why they exist. And the Department of Health has been eerily silent. Where is the director? She should be screaming up and down and advocating for vulnerable homebound patients across the state.
And the governor, has she opined on this yet?
So the governor, through the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the outgoing DEA Director of Elderly Affairs, have stated that they support this in concept, that they like the option, but they do not like how the bill is currently drafted.
Mm.
But beyond that, your guess is as good as mine as to where they're looking at. And I also recognize that it's an election year as well.
Right,
So-
and the question is, will she sign the legislation and force him, or will she veto it and force him to override the veto? What, I'm gonna ask you to play, Karnak here. Karnak, if you're a certain age, that was the
Where's
Johnny
the
Carson.
envelope on the head?
Right,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Johnny Carson magician character.
Again, I'm older than I look.
Prospects for, now, it's out of Senate Finance? Or, I'm sorry,
Oh, no, good point. It doesn't even have a fiscal note, Pat. It passed through House Labor. It's in House Finance, excuse me, it is in House Finance now. It passed through Senate Labor, no fiscal note, no nothing. Didn't go through the Senate Finance chair, and is going to be on the Senate floor on Wednesday. House is still considering it.
now, and we're gonna get into East Providence, and we might run a little long, but that's fine, but we're gonna get East Providence politics for a second. But so, this of course is the opinion of station management, and not my guess, but, so you're telling me Billy, who looks like Claude Rains, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Claude Rains didn't play the nice Senator Connolly, hasn't weighed in on this issue, despite his campaign rhetoric that he worries about the elderly?
No, the chairman has not weighed in on the issue. I eagerly wait his response. I have inquired, and I know that he has at least told me that he's going to look into this issue.
Oh, good.
But
Please.
I don't know. I don't know where his stance is. He is my state senator, so I will inquire again over the weekend. But no, he hasn't taken a position yet on the issue publicly.
Yet, give him a chance to opine on your Pawtucket Red Sox.
It will be ours if the taxpayers subsidize it. We will all own it.
I don't think anyone has any idea what's being talked about right now behind closed doors, up at Mordor there. That's astonishing, by the way. I mean, Billy Connolly would have you think he is the man behind. He is the throne of all things finance, and this in a Senate that's prided itself on being somewhat resurgent in asserting its constitutional powers. Yet, when it comes down to, air quotes, things that matter, yikes. That's disturbing.
I mean, I won't throw my senator under the bus.
No, it's fine.
That's yours, yeah. But
I won't.
and I will take him at his word that he has not had the opportunity to review the bill. Certainly, his finance committee has a number of other bills, or approximately 2,000 bills that are at least considered in the legislature
Right.
in any given session.
Which is
So
part of the problem.
I will give him the benefit of the doubt, but knowing that it's now posted on the Senate calendar for Wednesday, I would like to hear what our finance chair in the Senate, his opinion is on this bill ahead of a vote on Wednesday.
As someone who's intimately involved in this and several other issues, at a certain point at the federal level, there's a mechanism by which a arm's length financial analysis is of the impact of all legislation is made. That seems to be constantly missing here. I mean, has there been any? Have the supporters of this atrocity come cocoa with any sort of financial analysis of what the potential quote-unquote savings is, the cost is, any sort of financial impact?
There's been no fiscal note calculation on this bill yet, so no cost savings analysis.
Right, and so by bypassing, neatly sidestepping Senate Finance, you don't have to. Wow. And that's why we call it Halitosis Hall, where the sausage is made. Tough
You know,
stuff.
But let me just opine for a second on the hearing itself in House Finance the other day, is that before the hearing on this bill, there was a hearing for the child care centers. And that the supporters of this independent provider bill were also very much in support of child care workers who make similar wages to our
Right.
CNAs. And their talking points were eerily similar to what we talk about in home care in our hearing that we had a couple of weeks ago. And they talked about providing higher wages and better resources and more adequate funding for the child care centers, which young children, it's a vulnerable population. But when we talk about the elder end of the vulnerable population spectrum, it was a complete flip of the script by this same group of progressive legislators. I'm sorry, I don't like the term progressive because it signifies progress, and not every issue are we moving toward progress. But this liberal end of the legislature that isn't taking a look at the investments that the state has made to make sure that it's a better place and a safer place to live, work, play, and pray if you so choose. And that's what makes it scary, is that we need to value our vulnerable elders in the same way that we value other vulnerable populations.
Let's talk East Providence for a few minutes. What is going on over there? Good old Coach Madden with his X's and O's on his little electronic board there would have had a field day discussing the most recent elections.
Yeah.
What? Yikes. Now, you've got a new position.
Yeah, so I am now a member of the Canvassing Authority, which we've been affectionately calling my consolation prize, since I am no longer running for the first elected mayor in the city. And let me take a second to thank everybody who has been sending their thoughts and prayers after I announced that I was suspending my campaign back in late February. My family was impacted by a traumatic event in which we are still going through, and we are living in dealing with that day to day, or as my kids will say, sometimes hour by hour, minute by minute if we have to. But we will get through what has happened to us as a family. I know that my wife and 2 kids are watching at home, so hi Suzanne and the kids. And we thank you for the thoughts and prayers, and we appreciate them, and please continue to keep our family in your thoughts and prayers. They are appreciated and recognized.
I just want to add on to that. You know, it's interesting when you made the announcement, as opposed to the usual reaction when something like that happens, the level of genuine concern people had, I think, was a reflection on you and your family. People were genuinely, there was a sense of worry more than anything else. You know, once people went to hell with politics,
Yeah.
it's all about family. And I was struck by that because, you know, you and I have met a few times and have got to know each other over the last year. But the feeling that I got from everyone was like everyone stepped back and really paused for a moment, and I think that's a reflection on you personally, and so to your credit. So you know, at that point in time when it's appropriate and you've got the desire to re-enter the fray, you know, we look forward to that moment. At the same time, obviously, as I mentioned at the time, we wish you nothing but the best, and you know, your ability to, you know, maintain a high level of attention to, you know, your professional demands is also a credit to you. So
Well, thank you, and that's really a credit to my board of directors who have been very sympathetic and have been very flexible with my family as we go through what we're going through, and we'll be able to talk about this at some point. I'm not able to discuss it today. And so we're asking, of course, for the media to continue to respect our privacy.
Absolutely.
But my board of directors have been wonderful and appreciative of everything that they have done for my family and I during this time of our crisis. But yeah, as far as, you know, East Providence is concerned, yeah, we weren't expecting that. I wasn't expecting to be appointed to the Canvassing Authority. Again, the consolation prize. But I think it's an exciting time to serve on this authority and to be able to help navigate this new charter and this new election process. I didn't expect that 3 members of the city council and members of the school committee were going to challenge what was in the current charter and challenge what was on the ballot as far as their terms. It's been an interesting process. And again, I didn't ask to be on the authority. The chair of the East Providence Republican City Committee, Kathy Santos, who is like a second mother to me, in some cases has been more of a mom than within my own family. And when she asks, it's hard to say no.
Right.
And so she's asked if she could put me on a list. She needed to put a minimum of 5. We were very concerned what the Democratic City Committee was going to put for their 5, and rightfully so. There were a couple of scary names that were on there that were not going to look at these issues that were ahead of the city in this changing time for our city as we change our city government. That we didn't look at it at a neutral or judicious eye. And so we had 2 of our 3 canvassing authority members leave. One was because of business obligations and had resigned. And then the other was because the person was a Republican and had changed their party affiliation, thus disqualifying themselves. So it led for 2 of 3 vacancies, and probably the most pivotal point for a canvassing authority. And so the councilman at large, who's not running for re-election and is not running for mayor, Jim Bryden, he is considered mayor. It's a ceremonial mayor position they give to who is the head of the city council. And he's the only citywide elected official. Had contacted me as well as the city solicitor's office and the city clerk's office, and had said that Mayor Bryden was seeking to appoint me, and I gave him every reason possible to not appoint me, you know, including that I had intended to run for this office and that I still had but was closing a campaign account. And the only reason why the campaign account was still open was that after I had made the decision to suspend my mayoral campaign, I dipped into my own pocket and paid back every single donor, approximately $10,000 out of my own pocket, to give back and encourage every one of my donors to give to candidates that would either make this city or this state more business friendly and a better place for people to live, work, play, and pray. And I felt that if I couldn't live up to my own message of my campaign, then I should never be in any political environment at all. And I felt that that was the most responsible thing to do and never looked back. But we contacted the Board of Elections, we contacted the Ethics Commission, we did our due diligence, and everywhere where I put up a red flag, they all got knocked down and said, nope, you can still absolutely serve. And so when I ran out of excuses to throw at Mayor Bryden, they said that they were going to move forward. And I only received, as well as the other seat, by another well-respected person in our community, Peter Barilla, a war veteran and a lifelong servant to the city. I have a lot of respect for Peter. He also received 2 of 5 votes. The 3 councilmen that were seeking the 4-year term instead of the 2-year that was on their ballot had all abstained. So yes, we received a majority of the current quorum, but not the majority of the council, which I disagree of the blurred line between what their appeal was and the ability to appoint us, but nevertheless we move on. To me, at the end, it all had to do with the ballot itself. I believe that the ballot is essentially the contract between the municipality and the electorate. And if it stated on there that it was a 2-year term, that's what voters agreed to vote for whoever they voted for.
Right.
So it was easy in that fact because the facts were already presented. The city of East Providence in the 12, 14, and 16 election did not implement the 2010 decision by the voters of the city to change the terms from 2 years to 4 years. And yes, they did vote for the 4-year term, but as a canvassing authority member, I felt that we've already passed through 3 election cycles. And if the city didn't act on it, then they need to go back to the electorate in the 18 election and say, you haven't elected them for 4-year terms. Do you want to elect them for 4-year terms? And then implement that, if so, in the next cycle. So this way it was staggered 4-year terms from the mayor.
Right.
So this way there was that true checks and balances instead of having a city council that sits for the same term as the elected mayor. Because you could have this powerhouse within the mayor's office and the city council that squashes the voice of the electorate and is only to the powerful few. And we do have a very powerful central coalition-wise Democratic City Committee that has controlled much of city's operations. But the problem is that it's caused us so many crises financially, turnover in city councils, that have led us to this point that we need to elect a mayor because we need to find somebody competent to lead our government.
How many town managers have you been through in the last?
I believe that our current city manager or interim city manager is number 8 in this period. I think we've gone through 7 of them in about 8 or 9 years.
What could possibly go wrong?
Go wrong,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Listen, when you're in a town, if the very fact that outsiders know who your board of canvassers is tells you, in the immortal words of a certain futuristic canine, Rutrow, you know, or Houston, we've got a problem. I just find it astonishing what goes on over there.
Well, and one of the things that Jim Hummel, who covered the story for the Providence Journal, caught on to is that I think I said just outside of the ear of the microphone is that I had said to the other two canvassing authority members, you know, I have to live in this town too, as we were facing several folks that we either didn't know were a lynch mob or those that were planning to run for office that were waiting on bated breath what our decision was.
Right.
And you know, it also came controversial when it came to the school committee, who was seeking to go back to 4-year terms under the statute, the state statute for school committees to serve either 3 or 4-year terms. They currently serve as 2, and the canvassing authority agreed in a majority on my recommendation that they must seek a waiver from the General Assembly. So the Board of Elections upheld all of the decisions that were made by the canvassing authority a couple of weeks ago. And now, the Board of Canvassers. So now it's back on to the school committee to then determine, you have about a month and a half at most left of the General Assembly session. If you're seeking 4-year terms in the next cycle, that seek the waiver from the General Assembly to revert back to the state statute. And the current waiver that they have to go on to 2-year terms. But if it comes to what my personal preference was, is that I tried to encourage the majority of the board, which I was unsuccessful, is that there is a difference between the executive branch, this new mayor position, and the legislative branch of municipal government, this city council. And I can see in this next election cycle the struggle in the infancy of the mayoral position, where you have a city council that has led the operations of the city to then be losing control and turning into that true legislative body. I think that there's going to be this push and pull for power until we're able to delineate what those two separate branches should look like.
Right. So, and in closing, that's it's going to be a cathartic process for a town like East Providence, where the politics are so personal, even by Rhode Island standards. One has to admit that, given the size, the tribal nature, and that's a compliment, because you've got strong families who have lived there for generations, who all have significant emotional, financial, personal investments in the city. That's a process that's just going to have to work itself out, and which is why it's important to elect a very, very strong personality as mayor, because they need to assert themselves, if for no other reason, to avoid a constitutional crisis.
But they also need to be competent to be able to manage the city finances, manage this difficult transition of management staff in which they'll inherit, and to be able to sustain a local economy, all of which we have clearly struggled to do in East Providence.
Right.
It's a great community. I'm a townie, born and raised. I raise my children in this community. I am very proud to be a townie, which was the reason why I ran, is because I was just so frustrated that I was seeing our community in such peril without significant leadership to say, we need to change direction, but not just change how we structure our government. They're two different things. And that there is no true plan on how to drive our economy and make it, again, a better place to live, work, play, and pray.
Well, in closing, that's the challenge that faces a great deal of Rhode Island.
True.
There are very few, what's that song, that pop song from the 80s, I Need a Hero?
Yes.
Right now,
Calling out for a hero.
Right now, on a number of levels, Rhode Island needs a hero. And that's why we're eager to see you back sometime in the future, because, quite frankly, I think you could be one of those heroes. And that's why we wish you nothing but the best. I appreciate you coming in here today to explain the inexplicable, which is to try and make sense out of, I'll use the word Byzantine, nature of healthcare reimbursements. And again, this should be lesson 101, and look beneath the label, look beneath the organization's name, look beneath the Pollyannish description that you see in the first 3 paragraphs of every bill, and actually get into the sausage, because it's, I know, you put the state on alert. I hope we can do something about it.
Yeah, it's time to end politics over patient safety.
And it's astonishing that we even have to say that.
Yeah, sad, but our reality.
God bless.
Thanks, Pat.
Nick Oliver, he is, of course, you can tell me the formal name of the organization.
The Rhode Island Partnership for Home Care.
The Rhode Island Partnership for Home Care. Folks, it's fair to say that, well, let's be blunt. Either you or someone in your family will be dealing with a member of Nick's group probably sometime in the very near future. And so the degree with which we approach this issue in a season crowded with critical issues is just very, very important. It's so hard, you know, there's a sense of whack-a-mole here in the state. Every 5 minutes there's a crisis du jour, and the late great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci referred to a lot of this as vapor legislation.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is that everyone who ever listens to this show will sometime in their immediate family be dealing with the results of what happens this week. And unfortunately, it didn't happen in Senate Finance. So, call your legislature.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break right now. John Marion is waiting in the wings, I believe. We went a little bit over. We always do that. I'm sorry. Well, actually, I guess we're not, because if we were really sorry, we wouldn't do it again.
That's it.
But we are, in fact, the coalition, loud and proud. We are, as always, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, La Prave, Providence, the naked city, the city of 1,000 stories. Listen, it's it's kind of a crisp night here in Providence. Please come down. Despite the pratfalls of our current mayor here, which you can find, by the way, literally on Go Local Prov. It's a must-watch. It really, really is. It's a wonderful night, and it's a wonderful time to live here in Rhode Island. And the capital city is clearly an indicator of that. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And of course, these and all other shows live in perpetuity by merely clicking on the link at the top of our page for our YouTube channel. Of course, the mothership, coalitionradio.us. You'll also find a link there, and it's tied into tonight's show, to a perpetual, kind of one of our favorite coalition shows of all time, when we had Stephen Brown, Executive Director of the Rhode Island American Civil Liberties Union, on, and we of course call that, and we link to that tonight, why you should join the ACLU. Tied into that was a rather fascinating announcement, seemingly, for a lot of us, kind of out of nowhere. The recurring battle for information relative to the events surrounding 38 Studios, the operation of 38 Studios, all of that has been shrouded in secrecy really since its inception. No one's ever really had a clear picture, despite the data dump that took place, a while ago by the state police, as to the complete picture. And to their eternal credit, there exists a loose coalition, a confederation, if you will, of organizations that have routinely fought to the shroud, if you will, the shroud of secrecy surrounding this, and really everything to do with Rhode Island government. It's laced with irony. We live in a time where all of our elected leaders continually point to transparency as almost their mantra, to the point where I believe one of the, Merriam-Webster, one of the dictionaries every year has a contest for the most loathed word in the English language. I have to believe after this year, particularly after the 2016 election, that the word transparency at some point should be banned from the English language, because anyone who uses it apparently has no regard for it whatsoever. I think in Seinfeld they would have called that bizarro world. But joining me today for the first time, someone who I had the opportunity to get to know a little bit in the run-up to the Ethics Commission, shall we say, the renewed Ethics Commission 2.0, is John Marion. He, of course, is the Executive Director, if I have that correct, of Rhode Island's Common Cause. Interestingly enough, they describe them, I think it's very, very apt, as the citizens' lobbyist. And the juggernaut that they form when they work so closely with the American Civil Liberties Union, the Rhode Island Press Association, in this case, New England Free Speech Group, has been critical over the last couple of years over a variety of issues in ripping away that shroud of secrecy. They are absolutely the citizens' lobbyists. And, you know, it was just a couple of weeks ago when, 10 o'clock at night, in one of the less glamorous circumstances at Senate Judiciary, when I happened to walk in to testify on a couple bills, you saw 3 or 4 of the usual suspects, and you're one of them. It's everybody kind of shows up for the 2A, and everyone will show up for the POSOX, but the nitty-gritty, the entry level, the bleeding edge, if you will, of democracy is when organizations like Senate and House Judiciary get together and debate election law. And they debate the minutiae surrounding it. And while most people's eyes glaze over, either from exhaustion or just from ignorance, you guys are right there on the front line. And I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for coming in today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If you can, let's take a couple of minutes to give folks, because folks will watch this tonight and then we'll replay this constantly during the week and the coming weeks. Give folks, if you will, kind of a Common Cause 101. I think folks are aware a little bit of the history, but as the role of Common Cause in the new millennium, and where you're taking the organization.
Yeah, so we go back to 1970, founded by a guy named John Gardner. He was the Health and Human Service Secretary for Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary for Lyndon Johnson, and but he was a Republican from Texas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is working
At the time,
working for a Democratic administration. He resigned in 1968, and then in 1970 he said, everybody in DC has a lobbyist, corporations have lobbyists, unions have lobbyists, citizens don't have lobbyists working on behalf of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were about a dozen people in Rhode Island at the time who said, we want to form a Rhode Island chapter of the organization. Some of them are still around, a couple of them are still around in their 90s and active with us. And we've been around almost 50 years. We work on about 5 different baskets of issues.
Right.
Open government, which we're going to talk a lot about. We work on ethics and related issues, elections and campaign finance, judicial selection, which is
Mhm.
a little different. And uniquely in Rhode Island, not in any of the other states we have a presence, we work on separation of powers.
Right.
Because that's a fairly young thing in
Mhm.
Rhode Island, only since 2004. So we have this sort of basket of issues, and it's a membership-based group. Hundreds of members all over the state donate, and that pays my salary and our rent and electrical bill, and they send me up to the General Assembly for lonely nights, like you mentioned, hanging out with my crew, Steve Brown from the ACLU and some others.
Randall Rose is there most nights.
Randall Rose is there most nights, and God bless him, because he's not getting paid to be there, unlike Steve and I. And so, we work on these issues. We have positions on all these different issues. Most of them we agree with the ACLU, some of them we don't agree with the ACLU on some campaign finance stuff. But, we're working for, and you sort of said it's almost an epitaph, but transparency. Trying to make sure that government is open and transparent for the citizens of the state, and nationally too, but my focus is largely on the state.
So let's go through the basket, and eventually we'll get to the 38 Studios issue
Yeah.
that kind of brought us together today. But we're just, I guess it's got to be about a year and a half post-Ethics Commission reform. If I can give just a brief synopsis, prior to the reform a year or so ago, the Ethics Commission in the state had found itself somewhat neutered by the Irons decision, in which Billy, the little General Irons, had managed to avoid prosecution and persecution based on the ability of a sitting legislator to, I guess, and I'm oversimplifying here, get away with just about anything if it was in the process of legislating. What happened as a result of that, and how is it working? How is the grant experiment working?
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar, Rhode Island has a ethics commission in our state constitution from 1986. One of the few that's a constitutional body. One of the few that covers all three branches of government and state and local officials. So it's a has a broad reach and a deep reach in the state. That commission, as you said, you put it really well. That commission lost its oversight in 2009 because of a state Supreme Court case over most of what a legislator does, right? Passing bills. The so-called core legislative acts of a legislator, voting on bills, introducing bills, were exempted from the oversight of the Ethics Commission because of this ruling in 2009. What that means in practice is from 2009 until 2016, when we won the victory, a legislator could introduce a bill that literally put money in their pocket and vote on the bill and lobby their fellow lawmakers on the bill. 2016, we got a ballot question before the voters. Most people remember November 8th, 2016 for the presidential election.
Right.
We remember it for having over 70% of the voters say, no, the Ethics Commission should have oversight over everything a legislator does as a legislator. So fast forward this week, the Ethics Commission met, and one of its functions is people who are public officials come before it and ask for advisory opinions. They say, I face an ethical dilemma, what should I do under the law? A legislator came before it for an advisory opinion this week. He works for a nonprofit that's funded as part of the state budget. They told him, you can't vote on these parts of the state budget, right? They couldn't have given that advice and they couldn't have enforced the law until November of 2016.
Right.
So what we see is legislators have to recuse from votes. So just yesterday, the Speaker of the House, there was a vote on a bill. He felt he had a business interest, he recused from the vote. And so you see these recusals. We haven't looked, we don't have enough data yet to kind of look, see if there's been an uptick. Because we did show there was after that Irons decision, there was a drastic,
Right.
like 70-80% decrease in the number of times a legislator recused. It'll take a few years to get enough data to see if there's that uptick.
Right, right. And that was so critical at the time because, you know, you've got two or three different levels of perspective from a sea change like that. And first and foremost is people's confidence in the process in and of itself. You know, before then, any stranger to the state would have been astonished to see that literally there was no need to recuse oneself from almost anything. Even what was clear conflicts of interest on a most fundamental, simplistic level were tolerated. And so this instantly dropped the hammer on that.
Yeah, now, there were still legislators who were recusing, even though they
Right.
weren't required to. But there was a pretty precipitous drop in the numbers of people who were. It's unclear, you know, it was unclear how many people weren't recusing and were they violating the code of ethics, you know, conflict of interest laws. But I'm sure in that almost 8-year period, there were people who were voting on things that were they shouldn't have been under the ethics law because there was no enforcement mechanism.
One of the controversies at the time of its passage and during the sort of rapid fire formulation that took place. I mean, this was a bill that was literally a 9-year overnight success.
Yeah.
I mean, you had this stalemate going on for years. For a number of reasons, political and otherwise, the climate suddenly changed. Negotiations were made at a high level, and you were intimately involved in them. And there was resolution. There was a little bit of compromise. But one of the controversies at the time was the period of time before and after an election process. How did that all work out? And have you got a feel yet for that, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, so one of the things that happened that coincided with that getting put on the ballot in the spring, summer of 2016 was that the legislators had voiced concern that ethics complaints are made for purely election reasons before an election. So people put out a press release saying, I file an ethics complaint against my opponent. And that's free advertising,
Right.
For their campaign. So the Ethics Commission adopted a rule that said that for a period before the election, they won't take any complaints against anybody who's on the ballot. Now, we supported that because we balanced it against the fact that Rhode Island's Ethics Commission is almost unique in the nation in that they make complaints public from the minute that they're accepted.
Right.
So most ethics commissions keep complaints secret. They will say, no comment. Did you receive a complaint? No comment. Rhode Island, they make it public so the whole world knows there's an ethics complaint against you. So so balancing that ours is the most open, it was being abused. So we were seeing people file complaints days before the election, knowing that the ethics process wasn't going to run its course in the next 2 weeks before the election, and the person wasn't going to be either found guilty or exonerated, but they were going to get that press, and it was going to be successful for them. People were mad at us for doing that, for supporting that moratorium, but I still think as a matter of public policy, it's not a bad idea as a balance to that transparent process. The alternatives, some of the alternatives, one was there was a proposal by the legislature to put that in the Constitution, that moratorium. Bad idea. Constitution very difficult to change. You know, there were other ideas of sort of watering down the Ethics Commission as part of some compromise. We thought, listen, let the Ethics Commission enact this rule. It'll take 6 votes of the Ethics Commission to change it. We're gonna go through a couple election cycles, see how it goes. And then if we think it needs to be changed, we'll ask them. We ask the Ethics Commission quite regularly to change their rules. So we're keeping an eye on it, seeing if it works.
Yeah, and one of the critical parts of the structure of this bill was that you approached both constitutional issues and statutory issues. So essentially, the day-to-day, the minutia of the operations, the tweaking, the fine-tuning can take place at a statutory level, but at the same time, the integrity of the solution was constitutional in nature, and as a result, making it far more difficult for a bad actor to go in there and try and neuter it again, and try and gut it. And at the same time, much care and feeding was taking as far as the constitutionality of it, so we wouldn't have a reprise of, again, as they called him back in the day, my words, not yours, the little general. Billy Irons ruled the Senate floor in a way that I'm not sure even if the current regime can take credit. So that was a critical success, and to your credit, that a lot of folks become aware of an organization like the ACLU or Common Cause in times of crisis. What I thought that was important about that moment in time was, while there was a problem, that pointed out to your organization's ability to engage in multi-level negotiations and to engage with state elected leadership and affect real change without the fire and the crisis behind it. I mean, it was a problem, it was recognized, and your organization worked to fix it. And that's, again, you have two issues. You have the actual issue of recusals and conflict of interest, but you also have the tremendous need at this point to reestablish in Rhode Islanders the notion that government at some level can work.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say this about our approach is you have to take the long view, right? So this was a lesson for me. I had started in the organization in late 2008. The Supreme Court decision was in June of 2009.
Right.
Most of my career with the organization had been spent with this issue, so
Right.
7-8 years with this issue. We had lots of setbacks on this issue, but you just have to keep it out there, keep it in front of the legislature, and then when the moment comes, you strike,
Right.
and you're prepared. And that's why we're lucky that we've had a Common Cause chapter since day one,
Right.
because we've been there. We were there in the 70s when they were pushing sunshine laws, right? Before we showed up, they would lock the doors of the legislature, hold the vote, and open the doors, the smoke would pour out, and they'd announce the vote.
A pope was elected.
Yep, and so, I won't say we take full credit for that, but we were there in the 70s pushing for the state level FOIA laws and the transparency laws. We were there in the 80s when the Constitutional Convention happened, pushing for an ethics commission. We were there in the 90s, changing the way judges were picked, downsizing the legislature. We were there in the aughts on separation of powers. We've just been there trying to
Consistently.
affect change over decades and decades. And
Right.
these are decades-long projects to change our Constitution.
No, absolutely, and the going to the most recent issue, and I bring this up only because I was, as part of the Clean RI Coalition, the challenge, of course, is you've got an organization full of different organizations with their own boards, and you're trying to develop consensus. I'm not sure if a lot of folks understand that, whether it be a political party or a good government group like your own, ultimately, the chairman / chief executive / executive director, whatever the term du jour is, you can't act unilaterally. You and I both have boards to report to.
Yep.
In my role as the chairman of a small political party, a growing political party, I've got an activist board who have very, very strong opinions. And you have a board that's got a long tradition and a lot of institutional memory and a lot of institutional wisdom at it. At the same time, you've got folks like myself who are bomb throwers and literally willing to set the streets on fire, and that is great for PR for a minute or two, but probably won't get much done up there in that Mordor up there, as we call it. You've got to take a studied, mature approach to get things done, because the whole point really is not to make a point, it's to get things done, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so, we're there to try to drive reform. And you have to have the reform to drive. So one of the things we do is, like you said, we have a board, and that board digs into these issues. It meets monthly, and it has committees, and they dig into these issues. They develop expertise themselves. I certainly guide it, And then, you know, we take positions on issues and we drive them forward.
Mhm.
Phil West, my predecessor, talks about, you know, that sort of light bulb moment in 1994 where the board said, listen, we're gonna take on separation of powers,
Right.
come hell or high water. It's gonna take us a while, and it did. It took them 10 years. But, you know, you take on those important policy issues, constitutional issues, because you think it's for the good of the state.
Well, and if you could just briefly, because I want to get into the judiciary before we get into transparency, but separation of powers is something that's kind of taken for granted at this point. And I've been here long enough to know when that wasn't the case. Could you explain that to folks?
Yeah, so people, you know, when you watch Schoolhouse Rock, you think three separate and equal branches of government, and it wasn't that way in Rhode Island, right? In a fun sort of Rhode Island history sort of way, we had a royal charter from 1663 when we joined the United States in the 1780s. We didn't write a constitution. We just went with what we were doing as a colony. And that meant having a supreme branch of government. It meant having a supreme legislature. There was a revolution in Providence and in Chepachet by John Dorr in the 1840s, or Thomas Dorr, to get a constitution. It took us till 1843 to have a literal written constitution for the first time. Still, it had one supreme branch of government.
Mm-hmm.
Late 19th century, you wanted to appeal your case to the Supreme Court, you were appealing it to the legislature, right? In the 20th century, the legislature really expanded its scope by not only creating the laws, by executing them, by building tons of boards and commissions
Mhm.
that carry out the laws that the legislature passes, and then they put themselves on those boards.
Right.
So the classic one is, you know, like Narragansett Bay Commission, Vinnie Mazzalella, who's still the chair, he was a member of the legislature,
A powerful member of
a
the
very powerful member.
He drained the lake.
And he drained the lake, and he was collecting campaign contributions, essentially from contractors who wanted to do sewer work. We said, no, you can't, you know, it's a fundamental, going back to Montesquieu, it's a fundamental thing to have the separation of the three branches of government and the three powers of government, to legislate, to execute, and to interpret. And so we wanted those legislators off those boards.
Right.
From 94 to 2004, we pushed that. Ironically, two of the champions were Sheldon Whitehouse, right?
Mhm.
He was actually the guy who initiated the idea with Common Cause, and Bob Flanders, his
Right.
possible opponent this fall in the U.S. Senate, who wrote a dissenting opinion for the Supreme Court, talking about Rhode Island having a quintessential parliamentary form of government. It's hard to think in the 1990s somebody talked about us having a parliamentary form of government in Rhode Island.
Right.
2004, we changed two sections of the Constitution. No longer can legislators sit on boards and commissions. No longer is there plenary power of the legislature in the
Mhm.
state. We have a stronger executive. It's still a weak executive compared to other states.
Right.
But it's stronger. So there's a little more balance there. And that's a big part of our sort of DNA as an organization.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things is that there are folks who still don't accept that. So there's bills put in every session, there's one or two bills put in that would violate the separation of powers.
Right.
And we're, at the time, in 2004, there were 60 groups in that coalition. It's down to us. So I'm the guy up there trying to kind of hold the wall on separation of powers every year. And we've been pretty successful. The Supreme Court backed us up in 2008 with a great interpretation and an advisory opinion. And so, you know, separation of powers is starting to take hold, but you always have to be vigilant.
I just want to reflect for a second and then come deviate. How important, after all of your experience and living in Rhode Island, were you a native Rhode Islander?
No, I'm from upstate New York.
Okay. So, how critical is it that we reinstitute or reinforce a civics education for folks in high school or younger folks?
Yeah, so actually I'm on the board of an organization called Generation Citizen.
Mm-hmm.
It started as a project of a student at Brown University,
Mm-hmm.
Scott Warren, 10 years ago. and they teach civics not in the classic sense of memorize the preamble to the Constitution,
Right.
but what they do is they started by training college students to go into urban middle and high schools, public high schools, and help students identify a problem in their community and come up with a solution and then drive for that solution. They've expanded, so now it's not all volunteers. College students, teachers will lead it, and they've expanded out into the suburbs. But they're the largest civics education organization in the state. And it's critical that people understand their government. I think a lot of people have lost touch with the understanding their government, understanding the basics of their government. I alluded to Schoolhouse Rock. I grew up in the 70s watching those videos, and you had this basic general understanding, and then you studied government in high school, and we're just not doing enough of that today. And I think, it has led to all sorts of issues with media literacy. There are a lot of related issues because of people's, becoming adults and not having that civic education growing up.
Well, and you look at some of the political dialogue, it's as strained and as difficult a challenge it is right now. A lot of it is based in a fundamental misunderstanding of exactly how government works. There's and that's on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
There's no one's got an exclusive on civics ignorance at this point. From the top on down in both political parties, there's this stunning, I don't know if it's a casual disregard or an intentional ignorance of how we've gotten to a country and how important some of the, I'll call it extra governmental, because they may not be implicitly provided for in the Constitution, but some of the standards in the matters in which we do things are so easily discarded now for political expediency, when in fact they have real relevance to running a successful government, and as a result, having a successful society. It's difficult. No, that's great to know. I'd like to know more about that organization and publicize that, because if that's happening, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Talk about judiciary for a while. I mean, the climate, the judicial climate that you guys inherited in a sense, what it became, but I'm right now it seems like we've got an exploding judiciary in the state, where you've got all sorts of levels being created, largely, I believe, for political favors, and they're doled out to retiring senators and state reps everywhere. What was the judicial climate in terms of, in how explain to folks how appointments take place, the appointment council and all.
So we have a fascinating history, and sorry to be given the Friday night history lecture in Rhode Island.
By the way, this is Wonk Central here. Listen, we want you to do this.
So they, it's hard to imagine, in 1986, while that Constitutional Convention was meeting in the House chamber down in the hearing room, they were holding impeachment hearings for the Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. So if you listen to Crime Town, there's an episode about when Chief Justice Bevilacqua was being impeached. Ultimately, he resigned. But he was being impeached for his mob ties, essentially. But the thing to remember about him was, before he was Chief Justice, he was Speaker of the House. And and this goes back to the lack of separation of powers, there is something called the Grand Committee. And the Grand Committee is when the House and the Senate meet together. And until 1994, when the House and Senate would meet together, and they would pick the 5 justices of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. And so, lo and behold, in 1976, they opened the doors, and here comes the new Chief Justice. It's the Speaker of the House. And after Bevilacqua resigned, here comes the new Chief Justice. It's the Speaker's best friend. And so, in the early 1990s, the Providence Journal won the Pulitzer Prize in investigative journalism for a series called Making of an Empire, and it was about the patronage empire in the Rhode Island court system, because the Speaker of the House, Matty Smith, had made the Chief Justice his aide, Thomas Fay, and he in turn made Matty Smith the court administrator.
Right.
And they were doing all sorts of fun patronage activities, and
Slush funds.
in the Projo uncovered it, and they, as I said, won the Pulitzer, and that led us to 1994, where we put something on the ballot called merit selection. And so prior to 94, state Supreme Court justices, the highest court in the state, was picked straight by the legislature, and oftentimes they were legislators. The inferior justices were picked for the inferior courts, were picked by the governor, very much like the federal model now, where the president appoints. We switched it all, on the most dramatic change of any state in the country, to everybody who wants to be a judge in the state, from the traffic judge, family court judge, all the way to the Supreme Court, has to apply to a 9-member judicial nominating commission. They vet the candidates, they interview them in public, they take testimony, public testimony on them, which can be quite dramatic sometimes, and then they vote in public to send a list of 3 to 5 names to the governor.
Right.
Now, in 94, every judge was switched to that, and at the time there were 0 what are called magistrates in the court system, and magistrates are essentially judges of limited jurisdiction. They're judges in all but name. They answer the same code of conduct. They literally wear a black robe, sit on a bench, have a gavel. What the legislature discovered is they started putting in the budget more and more magistrate positions.
Right.
So now we're up to 20 magistrates. There's going to be a vote next week to add another one. And while that merit selection system sort of severed the tie, where the revolving door, closed the revolving door from the legislature to the bench, the magistrate system opened it back up. So the ranks of the magistrates are filled with former legislators and legislative employees and family members, former Speaker of the House.
Is there a sitting senator who's a judge right now?
Not sitting, no. They're municipal court judges who are members of the legislature, but you can't be a member of the state judiciary and a sitting legislator. But these magistrate positions have opened up sort of a new revolving door between the legislature and the bench. And so we have been trying to kind of close that by pushing legislation that would require these magistrates to go through the same public vetting process.
Right.
Now, it's not perfect. That public vetting process, is subject to some political manipulation too. But at least the public gets its say, and the public can watch it. And we think it's better, if you, on a number of different measures, including the diversity of the bench, which is a big issue, that the top of the criminal justice system does not look like the people who go through the criminal justice system. That the bench is more diverse racially than the magistrates, and we think for a number of reasons we want to change that way the magistrates are selected. It's amazing you craft sort of the perfect reform back in '94 in our eyes, and then there are ways around that reform that people figure out.
Oh, no, absolutely, and for a lot of us that are concerned by, when you look at a national level, at least on a top-side analysis, a great deal of investigation, when you look at SCOTUS or even at the federal circuit judges, a great deal of analysis is done as to whether they're strict in terms of the Constitution. Do they see the Constitution as a living, breathing organism? All of that takes place. We've got a situation, without naming names, where the former chief of staff of a recent governor, apparently, and again, this is where you actually speak truth as opposed to some of the misconceptions that may cloud the political horizon here, managed to avoid, I guess, some level of revolving door legislation and become a Superior Court judge. And it wasn't based on his long history of jurisprudence. How do we get to a model in this state where, and there clearly have been some surprises, I mean, in terms of politically appointed judges who have actually conducted themselves quite well.
Yeah, you know, and I don't mean to slight the judiciary, you know, it as a whole, right? I think people there are serving. Our thing is about giving everybody a shot to sit on the bench, right? We think a good or a great lawyer who is not politically connected deserves the same chance as a lawyer who is politically connected. And under the, you know, what we've been fighting for 30 years, quite honestly, is to give the good non-politically connected lawyers that shot.
Right.
You know, there certainly are loopholes that are found all the time. You know, you mentioned a former governor's chief of staff, who, by all accounts, is a great lawyer or a great judge.
That's actually what I was talking about.
Yeah.
At the time, he was.
But it was controversial
Right.
because he made, you know, the chief of staff has a role in judicial screening in the governor's office.
Right.
And he was told, well, if you kind of step aside from that process, you can go through it. And you know, I agree with that decision. That was by our state ethics commission. You know, which again, nothing's perfect.
Right.
We can only strive for perfection. But you know, it's these reforms take constant care and feeding, right? You don't just enact them, put the words on paper, and then walk away and you know, hope for the best. You have to be there to kind of hold the wall.
And that's a critical point, because there's the concept, and you know, there's a couple of non-elected officials. Ken Block comes to mind, who's been very successful in one or two cases. One in actually enacting the elimination of the master leveler, which was an absolutist kind of success. I mean, it's gone, and someone would actually have to physically re-vote it back into place. But whether it be organizations like yours or the occasional good government icon, you've got this notion that once, okay, next, when in fact it really, there is no next, is there?
Yeah, I mean, they keep moving the finish line on you to some degree. And so, yeah, judicial selection, as soon as we got that, and it was huge, like I said, the most sweeping change any state ever enacted, they created these magistrate slots and they just started multiplying. Separation of powers, you know, passed in 2004. By 2008, we were in front of the Supreme Court because they were arguing, you know, that the legislature was arguing that the CRMC, the Coastal Resources Management Council, wasn't subject to the separation of powers. You know, there will always be attacks on reform, and you'll always have to answer those attacks because otherwise, like I said, it's just words on paper. So it is crucial to constantly be following this stuff and monitoring this stuff and calling it out. You know, the best example is, I think, the public records law, right? So the public records law, when I started, as Steve Brown used to point out, had there's these exceptions, right? It'll say everything's a public record except, and then it was A, B, C, D. I started 10 years ago, and it was A through Z, 26 subsections of that statute. Now I think we're up to 30, right? They just multiply, and it's like whack-a-mole. Every session, here comes another couple of exceptions to the public records law. Chip away. And before you know it, you know, your reform is a piece of Swiss cheese. There's so many holes in it.
Well, and that I think is a critical point as well, because we've all seen these horrific pictures of lava moving slowly, and that's really what happens, isn't it? It's you know, I look at, you know, for example, you know, this past year we were treated to the outrage of the prescription medical database becoming you know, accessible without warrant. To me, as a civil libertarian, I describe myself as a civil liberties hobbyist. I operate at nowhere near yours or Stephen's level, but at the same time, you know, it's kind of an obsession of mine. That was something that was attempted, and then attempted, and then attempted, and then in a moment of, they're waiting for an opportunity to kind of slide something in. There are forces out there that wait for the eye to be off the ball, and all of a sudden, okay, we can, in the midst of this crisis du jour, the Paw Sox, the UHIP, any one of the other normal day-to-day outrages that seem to take place in Rhode Island, and allow us sort of this backdoor approach to getting things slid by. How can you as an organization, because you guys are warriors, how can you, last week I stumbled on, I was going to House Finance to argue against the sugar tax, because it will put one of my sponsors and a good friend of mine and a great Rhode Island, you talk about icons, an iconic Rhode Island company out of business. I missed that because I was, it happened so early in the day, and I stumbled on this, a senator in Senate Judiciary. The Judiciary is kind of like the Cheers of Rhode Island legislature. They're always open, and they're always doing something, and they're the light at the end of the, right at the end of the hall there. And they're trying to pass a law to eliminate the requirement for a political platform, which I found outrageous. How do you summon folks to constantly, people are exhausted at this point.
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is you have to pick your battles. I think it's a question of strategy, but you can't, there are a lot of things to be outraged by, but you have to wait for the ones sometimes that are the worst, because if you're constantly crying, then people tend to ignore you. Now, I guess the exception to that, I'd say, is the ACLU. The ACLU, I have, like I said, we disagree with them on a lot of issues, but holy cow, do they cover a lot of ground, right? He'll testify on 600-700 bills per session. And he's very effective. Oftentimes, the chair of the committee will say, I want the sponsor of the bill to go negotiate with Steve on some compromise language to satisfy the ACLU. They do sort of speak up all the time. We, I think, are a little more judicious in picking our battles so that we can have people pay closer attention, because I feel if you are constantly screaming about things, people kind of tune you out.
Now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it strikes me now, having followed both organizations closely for a number of years, your focus is on real institutional change, that you're looking at how large institutions interact within government and with the public, and seeing sort of some of these really almost glacial big picture issues that have to be addressed. The ACLU is very finely focused on some of the day-to-day outrages that can take place in terms of judicial incompetence, poorly crafted laws that affect a lot of day-to-day life and day-to-day liberty type issues. Fourth Amendment issues, which are critical, but very often are events-based, I guess I would say. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of distinctions. One of them, one is, yes, I think we tend to engage in longer-term campaigns for change, like the ethics change, and they're focused on sort of the shorter term, in some instances, of holding the line on civil liberties. The other huge distinction is that they do a ton of litigation.
Right.
That is not an arrow I have in my quiver. We litigate very rarely. I think they have like 60 volunteer attorneys, and they file suit all the time. We just joined them, right, on a brief today. Which
is a great segue into why why I reached out to you and asked you to join us tonight, because it's apparent as a more than a casual observer of the process that this word transparency, you've got it for a number of factors, the explosion, if you will, of the public relations industry within state government as employed by state government, in administration. And by the way, there are times as a bomb thrower I engage in demonization. We're not going to in this conversation. But clearly you've got a trending executive branch that clearly, and we're going to discuss some specifics, are engaging in a long-term campaign against transparency. My words, not yours. You've got, because of the evolving nature of these laws, whether it be decriminalization issues or whether it be the way technology now is impacting legislation and how we do things differently as a society, you've got more pressure than ever. And so you all got together today. There is a coalition, and it's interesting because the Rhode Island Press Association seems to be, and they've been around for years, and I've had their director on the show. She's wonderful, she's a professor emeritus at the University of Rhode Island. But it's clear that within the last 2 or 3 years, your organization, ACLU, and their organization has joined with a handful of others on an interchangeable basis to address transparency and public access to records. So what happened today, what was the initiative today, and what does it stem from?
Yeah, so everybody's familiar with the 38 Studios. There were several investigations related to 38 Studios. One of them was a grand jury was impaneled for quite a number of months, and the grand jury did not return any indictments. And that was announced in, I think, 2016. And Governor Raimondo sued to get the grand jury records and have those made public. Now, normally grand jury records are secret for a good reason, right? So people are brought before grand juries, they're grilled, oftentimes without having an attorney present. And it can be a one-sided affair, and in favor of the prosecution, right? The whole joke is a good prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich, get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. So the vast majority of time, grand jury records are sealed and they never see the light of day. But they're, and that's under a rule of the court. I think it's 6A, the rules of Rhode Island criminal procedure. But there's an exception built in there that under extraordinary circumstances, the grand jury records can be unsealed and revealed to the public if it's in the public interest. And what we did today is we signed on to a brief before the Rhode Island Supreme Court that was authored on behalf of the ACLU by a couple of Roger Williams University law professors, Andy Horowitz and Jared Goldstein, supporting the governor's suit to get the grand jury records unsealed. The governor went to Superior Court, so the way it normally flows is you go to the chief of the Superior Court, you ask them to unseal the records, and they can make a determination. She determined no, she didn't want to unseal them, so the governor appealed to the Supreme Court. And we came in as a friend of the court with these other groups to say, we support the governor's position here, which is that these records should be unsealed because there's extraordinary public interest, right? And the public interest there is that this was, tens of millions of dollars of public money. It was a decision made by a couple of public bodies, the EDC board, Economic Development Corporation board at the time, and the General Assembly on behalf of the people of Rhode Island. That money was wasted. We don't know all of where that money went. And everything's pretty much done. The civil suits are over. The criminal investigation seems to be closed. The grand jury is done, but the public still doesn't know the whole story.
Right.
And so these grand jury records might get us a little closer to the whole story. And we think the public deserves to see them because the public deserves the whole story. As everybody who lives in the state knows, any issues you talk about, people say, don't let it be another 38 Studios, right? The Paw Sox, the Thane Tower. You raised anything.
As one of the people involved in the hashtag 38 Stadium, and I had on the show a few weeks ago, now we've got 38 Towers.
Yep.
And I just, if I can clarify that for a second, because this is an important, it's critical to myself and the political movement I'm involved in. When we describe it as that, there's two mechanisms at work. Number one, the the use of the type of bonding that took place, and the mechanics of how it took place, and the lack of oversight and the lack of understanding of the investment, all that. But we term it that because to us, it's symptomatic of the incredible arrogance that one section of Rhode Island government has in continuing to inflict on the electorate and the taxpayers these grandiose visions which are typically have been abject failures, and they do so despite overwhelming public opposition. And when they fail, there's this sort of, well, there's this constant mantra of, well, we just need to move beyond that. I find the governor's position on this interesting because she was elected in part because she was going to engage in a full public investigation. She chose not to. She's run hot and cold on the release of these records as well as other records, but that's neither here nor there. You're right in pointing out that there is a hangover from this process that cannot be exorcised in the full sense of an exorcism until these are completely vetted. And I'm not going to. You're not a politician. You're an activist who leads a storied organization locally. So I'm not going to dive into political motivations for it. But at the same token, you've got this institutional resistance, particularly it would appear from the Attorney General's office, in getting to the bottom of this. Without waxing or taking shots at the Attorney General, and that I would do that, you wouldn't. You're very judicious. Why is that? Why is this government, particularly now, because this isn't the first time you've gotten together with this coalition to discuss open records, why is this current, and I'm not just pointing out to Ms. Raimondo, but the entire regime, the entire mess, so obstinate in keeping these away from the public?
Yeah, I mean, so you're right to say that our governor, has had sort of two positions on this. She ran saying there should be an independent investigation, didn't push that once she got in office.
Mm-hmm.
And then and when we say independent investigation, I think a lot of people in the state think RISDIC, right? So when the credit unions collapsed, there was a full sort of public vetting of what the hell happened. And the carved in sand document was written explaining what the failures. And I think people wanted that. They wanted the 200-page, this is the definitive history of what the heck went wrong. And a lot of people held out hope that you'd get an independent investigation that would produce that. She said, well, let's let the litigation run its course. And then to her credit, when the litigation ran its course, when the civil litigation was over, when the criminal investigation seemed over, she said, let's see him. Let's see what the grand jury did. And the AG has opposed it, releasing these records. As institutionally, I guess, representing sort of the law enforcement perspective, he anyone in his shoes probably would, right? I wouldn't expect an AG necessarily to say, let's open up the grand jury records, because that's a tool that that office uses.
Mm-hmm.
They probably don't want to set a precedent for that, their tool to be made public. But yeah, there's this clash happening at the highest level between the governor and the AG over this. We've just, we're pretty consistent about, let's just make things public.
Mm-hmm.
What government does in the name of the people should be public. Historically, I'll say, unlike the ACLU, we haven't litigated about it much. Our role has been to change the law. So in 2012, we worked with the Press Association, League of Women Voters, and ACLU to change the public records law to make it stronger. Right now, we have a bill to change the open meetings law and make it stronger.
Who's sponsoring that, do you know?
So in the House, it's Senator Craven, or Representative Craven, and in the Senate, it's Senator Archambault.
Okay.
And we've had it in for a couple of years, and in all honesty, it's not going anyplace this year. But like I've said, we'll be persistent, and maybe the next AG will be our champion of that or something, and we'll get a shot at changing that. But we look at changing process, over the long term, and giving the media and citizens a set of tools that they can then use to try to pry open government. We don't do a ton of crowbar work ourselves trying to pry, as much as we sort of give other people tools to pry themselves, is the way we put it. So I don't file a lot of ethics complaints, I don't file a lot of campaign finance complaints. I will from time to time, but more focus on, let's make it so citizens and the media can do these things.
Do you think, and touching on the media, clearly the media situation in the state is very, very fluid. And organizations like yourself need the outrage of the media to drive, I think, public sentiment to a certain degree. You're, as the wisdom that's flown out of your office and similar organizations, the 2 or 3 good government groups, back when Operation Clean Government was a real force, I mean, good people still working at it, but and the ACLU and a handful of other groups, is critical in terms of actually engaging in the sausage making. But you need an active, vibrant, forceful local media to gin up the outrage sometimes necessary. Without naming names, is the media doing a good enough job of this in this state?
Well, I mean, so, there's no doubt across the country, the media is shrinking, right? So, particularly newspapers. So historically, newspapers were cash cows, and as a result, they produced a lot of investigative journalism. The Providence Journal was, at one point, had the deepest market penetration of any regional newspaper in the country. That meant more people in Rhode Island were subscribing to the Journal and than any newspaper that wasn't a national paper in the country as a percentage of the population. And it was hugely profitable, and it employed storied, layers of investigative reporters, many of whom went on to other papers and wrote,
The editor of the New York Times right now is a alumnus of the Providence Journal.
Yeah, started as an intern or something like that. And so they've shrunk tremendously. The people who are left are trying their damnedest, right? And they're digging. But quite frankly, there used to be an East Providence Bureau, and your prior guest was talking about all the turmoil in East Providence. Most people don't know that's happening because there's no East Providence Bureau of the Providence Journal. There used to be bureaus all over southern New England that don't exist, so that means that in many cases there are parts of government that just aren't being covered by anybody. So we're uncovering less. I mean, it has to be true. If there's fewer people covering things, less is being uncovered. Are there other things that didn't exist that, in the Providence Journal's heyday that exist now? We're sitting in one of their studios, right? Go Local didn't exist, and they've uncovered things. You have, other models. Dan McGowan at WPRI is covering Providence City Hall, and it has an unbelievable Facebook group, something we couldn't have imagined 15 years ago, uncovering stuff in the city. It's evolving. It shrank as a whole, and it's evolving, but it's not. We just don't have that breadth and depth that we once had, and that is bad. That's why actually my philosophy is you have to create tools for citizens to do it. It used to be media did it on behalf of citizens. Now you have to create tools for citizens to do it. So one thing I have in that open meetings bill is stream more public meetings, right? A third of city councils and town councils in Rhode Island, without any law, stream their public meetings and put them up online. Let's make them all do it, right? Because if you're not gonna have the Projo covering the Gloucester Town Council, but you live in Gloucester and you wanna know what happened, but you missed the meeting, you should be able to go online in 2018 and click a button and see it.
Interestingly enough, in Cumberland, where I live, the council president there not only streams, but also has set up, and this may sound simplistic, but I think you get it more than most. Public comment can occur at the beginning of the meeting and at the end of the meeting, giving working taxpayers or taxpayers with child care, any one of a number of issues that would prevent them from participating in the spot, giving them two ways to,
And good for him, because there's nothing in the law requiring public comment.
Right.
One of the things people call our office all the time with open meetings questions, and one of the things, the big outreaches is they don't allow public comment, and actually the law doesn't require it, of a town council. So good for the town councils, right? And some people think I'm too negative, and we're negative about government. No, good for the third of cities and towns that are doing it without a mandate.
Right.
Right? I would hope, we don't need to pass a law. I would hope that they will all take that step. Hopefully, having that bill in, sends the signal that get on the train, because eventually it's gonna leave the station. But, you know, in the absence of that media, people are gonna have to take it upon themselves, and they're, you know, we have to give them the tools to do it. And we need a good open meetings law, we need a good public records law. You know, the one thing I will say is, in my decade, you see government, I think, being a little, and it's not true of every department, it can be uneven, but using the exceptions in the public records law more, sort of nickel and diming you to death
Right.
on getting records. You know, and that is just, the default should be make it public, not the default should be let me find one of the 30 reasons why I don't have to make it public.
Well, and again, you know, I'll bring up political figures. I'm not asking you to comment on the political nature of this, but Patricia Morgan has been very, very active in trying to demand records from a variety of quasi-governmental agencies. And I mean, first off, your comment, stepping aside from Rep. Morgan, but your comment on the notion that government will charge, in some cases, enormous amounts of money for access to public records. And we all get the point that there's costs involved. Nickel a page or something, but.
Yeah, 15 cents.
Yeah. But what's your thought on that? Because that's becoming, you know, as responsibility for this is being driven down from a shrinking major media presence to a variety of indie media, you know, larger ones like Go Local, smaller ones, well, like, quite frankly, like myself. What's your thought on the expense, and is that an intentional barrier to prevent public access?
Yeah, I mean, so there has to be a balance, because one of the things people don't realize about public records is there's a lot of commercial enterprises that request public records in huge quantities, right? So data mining firms will make huge public records requests that would, quite frankly, if they were free, tie up government forever. Like, government would do nothing but respond to public records requests from commercial data mining firms if it were free. So there needs to be some mechanism for the government to recoup the time it's taking to do the request. The problem is that it can also be, you know, used as a shield against the public interest in these requests. So, you know, my solution is, and Providence has done this, right? So after I chaired a commission for the Tavares administration on open government, and one of the suggestions was, once you answer public records request, you put it online for everyone, right? So you come along 60 days later and you want the same public record, oh no, I don't have to make the request, it's up there. And so they have a huge database of public records, and they just, you know, you can go get them, and you don't have to make that repeat request. And so that's one solution to this problem. But the nickel and diming can be unreal sometimes, especially when there really is public interest in these the public having access to these records. So, yeah.
Or in a case, and again, at the risk of getting political, when a certain gubernatorial candidate a year or two ago asked a current governor for records revolving around the potential location of toll, she was given 19th century highway records, and clearly what was a my comment, not yours, a sort of a political dig, if you will. But, and you've been here a long time, but there's so many things I want to ask you. I mean, one of the things I touched on early on, and I believe this is also a shield against transparency, is this burgeoning growth industry in this state, and that's called communications directors. Are you, in your anecdotal conversations with your peers across the country at other common cause, are there state and local governments exploding with communication directors like Rhode Island? I mean, we must have the highest per capita.
So that's actually interesting. That's something I do communicate with my peers on a lot of things. We talk about trends that we see happening in the states. That's not one that I've never thrown that question out, and it would be interesting to throw that question out. Yes, there seems to be it seems to be a growth industry in Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
There is a need for a certain level for government to get the message out, and the question, there are two issues. One is, the scope, how many departments need them?
Right.
And I think there are departments that need them and don't have them. And then the other question is, when do they cross the line from giving out information on behalf of government to giving out political information, serving as sort of cross the line into almost quasi-campaign activity, and that's a really tough line to police. There's a law about money being spent on the broadcast of images of statewide elected officials in election year, a certain number of days before the election, but that doesn't cover, is the press secretary for this person, the press secretary for the campaign too. You see, like Governor Raimondo now, David Ortiz left the administration now, is on the staff of the campaign, and that's good, and that should happen. We're starting to see it with the other folks running for office who are incumbents. But it can be a tough line to police.
Mm-hmm.
When does the election begin, right?
Right.
Does it begin the day after you're elected? Does
Mm-hmm.
the re-election begin? I don't know. But yeah, no, Kathy Gregg has certainly chronicled the growth in PIOs or whatever term you want to call it in state government, and in part of it is that I think the government thinks that in the absence of media, they have to take it straight to the people. So in a weird way, it may be a reaction to the shrinking of the media, that government is doing more of this.
Yeah, the challenge to us, and this, again, not getting personal here, is that when you've got that fine line, there's certainly been a lot of discussion on the major media, amongst media people, about the line between the business side of a news organization and the reporting side of a news organization. And that's up for debate. To me, what's especially troubling, though, is that fine line that's supposed to exist between media and eventually those individuals becoming integrated into the organization that they just were covering, in some cases, days beforehand.
Yeah, and so there's been a couple of high-profile instances where people in Rhode Island were in the media, and they've now gone over to working for government. And I'll say this, it's a sign. These are people with families trying to feed their kids, and so they're
Understood.
the newspaper's shrinking, so they jump to a stable job. But I mean, I think it's legitimate to say, when were you interviewing for that job? Were you interviewing for that job while you were also covering that person?
Mm-hmm.
I would hope I don't think anybody tells their boss, hey, I'm interviewing for a job to leave you. You have to rely on a person's personal ethics to say, you know what, I'm gonna tell my boss, for right now, I can't cover that story.
Right.
I won't explain why. And you know, I don't know that anybody was interviewing for jobs while they were covering certain things, but it you know, it's increasingly a problem because people are, as the media sheds jobs, you're trained to do to write and do sort of public outreach through journalism, and so you go into the only other field, and you go into the growing field, which is the public relations of government.
Right. I mean, in the most recent situations, it was fascinating because you had two very distinct scenarios. You had the more seemingly now traditional move from newspaper person to press relations person.
Mm-hmm.
To me, what was more troubling was when you had a move from an individual who was covering a story directly into the, if you will, the sausage making, directly into the policy section of government. And that I find especially troubling. And I'm wondering, and again, I'm not here to obsess over names or individuals, but I'm wondering if you feel, and this is kind of a survey I take of everybody that comes on the show that's press aware and media aware and savvy as you are, that is that a line once crossed, you can no longer come back?
Oh yeah, I mean, you don't see people go back into the media very often. There have been some high-profile cases. Jim Taricani,
Right.
you know, legendary investigative reporter in Rhode Island, was the spokesperson for a governor, and you know, went back to Channel 10 after that. And I don't think people sort of thought twice. I wasn't here when he crossed back over. He was already back at Channel 10. I remember the day I came to Rhode Island to look for a house. My wife got a job here. I had never been in the state before.
Nice.
Turned on the TV, it's Channel 10, and it was the day, I believe the day the Frank Carenti tape came out.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, what the hell?
What have I
and
done?
so- where am I moving? And, you know, so Jim went back.
Right.
And so he sort of went through the revolving door
Mhm.
both ways. I think we're heightened to it now because the numbers are greater, and because the numbers of people going through the revolving door are greater, because particularly the shrinking of the paper here. And so you see the Pulitzer Prizes come out every
Right.
year in the spring. And the last couple of years, when they've awarded the Pulitzer Prizes, at least one of the reporters had left journalism by the time they got the award.
This past year, the Pulitzer Prize for Photography
Yeah.
was won by someone who had not only was in the process, had left, had been gone. In this case, in certain case, in fact, one of his last official acts as a photographer, and this was down in Virginia, Charlottesville. Literally, I believe on either his next to last day or last day, was to cover the tragedy of the Charlottesville protests.
Yeah.
And what's equally compelling to me is that, you know, I'll look at the situation, I'll name a name here, Jim Hummel. What's fascinating to me is that his, and full disclosure, Jim's nice enough to have me on his show every couple of months, and but he's actually crafted an external investigative reporting unit that essentially, for lack of a better term, contracts out to a number of major media outlets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, I think there was a moment, 5 or 6 years ago, where people thought the future of journalism is nonprofit journalism, which Jim operates as a 501c3 nonprofit. And you started to see, like, ProPublica, I can't pronounce it, which is a national nonprofit that does investigative journalism. I think people thought that was the model, but it hasn't scaled at the, you know, there are a couple big national, Center for Public Integrity, ProPublica, that have done it, but you don't see, you know, Jim's a one-man band, and boy, he uncovered a doozy in East Providence, and good for him. But there are many more stories that Jim can't get to because he's a one-man show, and so that nonprofit model doesn't seem to be working as well at the local level,
Right.
Which is a shame.
Well, what's interesting to us too is we deal with an organization here called the Goldwater Institute, and they bless us. We're very, I am uniquely blessed because I have, folks like you willing to spend their Friday nights here, a whole group of organizations. But what's fascinating about the Goldwater Institute is it started out as a somewhat right-of-center libertarian think tank, and they have integrated 2 additional units. One is an investigative reporting wing, which is run by a prominent investigative reporter from the Southwest, and at the same time, they've created I know a couple of agencies have done that. They've created an organization as part of their overall picture, which literally creates, I'll call it for lack of a better term, plug-and-play legislation. And they're approaching a couple, for example, they are one of the leading forces behind right to try legislation at the state level, and they've had a number of successes in individual states where they've essentially partnered with a sponsoring legislator and introduced and passed legislation, campus free speech. So I guess the only rule is there really are no more rules.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional lines in journalism between the business and the reporting are blurring. The lines between nonprofits who are advocacy and journalism are blurring, and it makes it more difficult to be a consumer of news.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that goes back to that media literacy. It's more difficult to consume news today because you don't know if there is a vested interest behind the news.
I assume it's interesting because I, from a historical perspective, I go back to, the first news organizations, prominent ones, semi-national in the 19th century, were all run essentially by robber barons who did have a distinct view. But the other challenge is finding sources of information which are original in nature. And when you think about it, so much of the major network coverage now is regurgitated. They're essentially covering other people's coverage.
Yeah, and the aggregation machines are unbelievable, and social media is riding the wave. It's difficult, and it go like you raised earlier. Civics education is part of it. Just sort of an educated citizenry that can consume news skeptically, right? Which is
Right.
sort of what they teach you in a liberal arts education. Is to be skeptical.
The much pilloried liberal
that
arts education these days.
The learning to be a news consumer with a skeptical eye is important, and not falling into the sort of trap of being in the echo chamber and only listening to one point of view, because it's dangerous. We get into 2 camps.
And which is why the irony here is this show is a complete creation of social media, but at the same time, a number of us have evolved to the point where we use social media simply to disseminate information, certainly not to gather it, certainly not to discuss it, because of that echo chamber. The algorithms are such that it's very difficult to find people willing to engage in the kind of reasoned, Socratic-based debate that used to be, every freshman college dorms midnight session. I mean, it just doesn't exist anymore. I certainly appreciate you coming in tonight and spending all this time. It's been wonderful. Tell folks how, and this is we always tell people that to please engage in shameless acts of self-promotion. How folks can support your organization? How can they get involved? And is there any next? And I'm going to put you on the spot, and feel free not to say anything. But is there any next big picture move? Today was certainly dramatic enough. You've formed, working with a coalition of organizations, are filing, and folks who haven't been involved in this type of litigation don't understand how powerful being a friend of the, filing that paperwork is. I mean, you're making a very powerful statement from, iconic organizations within the state that it's necessary, it's critical, that there's an exigent crisis at hand within the state. And tell me if I'm off base here, but I think in reading it, that this is an extraordinary moment in Rhode Island's history, where in order for us to move forward as a state, we can debate what moving forward is, but we all agree that there is this roadblock that exists both mentally, financially, and philosophically called 38 Studios.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the idea that we don't have the full story of the biggest scandal since the banking crisis.
Right.
Period. Like, I don't think anybody would debate that the sort of, biggest scandal since that period is 38 Studios. And people want an answer. And so let's go try to get as full an answer as we can get. And maybe we won't find it, maybe you get the records and you don't find it, but at least you didn't leave that rock unturned.
Right. And folks won't be able to then look back to that and obsess over, throughout history, there are events that, through the failure to explain properly at the appropriate time, have taken on this sort of mystic dimensions, so that people become enmeshed in conspiracy theories that sadly very often are exponentially more complicated than the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to be disappointed when push comes to shove. You've got a couple of bad actors who are clearly leeching off of bad special interest legislation, and you had a whole lot of people who are kind of embarrassed because of their inability to vet what should have been a very straightforward investment, and said, this stinks. Let's move away. And it's simply, if that's all we find out of it, then we've set the precedent. We've drawn the line in the sand. We realize that we should never be. What's that stadium? As a libertarian, we should never be investing taxpayer funds in a private enterprise again. I'm wondering if perhaps maybe we finally learned that from 38 Studios, and 38 Stadium won't happen. But let's learn the lessons and then move forward. The inability of government to, and as Dan York would say, walk and chew gum at the same time is troubling. How can people support Common Cause, and where can they find you on the web? And,
Yeah, so
and what do you got coming up?
There's lots of ways to follow us. The website's commoncauseri.org, commoncauseri.org. I'm on Twitter, Common Cause RI, Facebook /CommonCauseRI, just seeing a theme here.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go to our website, sign up for emails, and we blast those out to you when we need you or want to share information with you. You can donate if you see fit.
And you are donation. This is very critical.
Yeah, we are
completely
funded
run
by members. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need that, right, to keep the doors open.
If people, there's this torrent of bitterness associated with the status quo. A very simple solution to combating the status quo is to support organizations like Common Cause.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I had to talk to a bunch of a while back to a bunch of Fulbrights who had come to the United States, right? So we send Fulbrights all over the world.
Right.
There's Fulbrights who come here, and it was a room of 200 people from all over the United States, and I had to introduce what I did for a living. And here I'd say, oh, we're a government watchdog or a good government group. There, in the rest of the world, we're called a civil society group.
Interesting.
And it's because we're part of the sort of civic fabric. We're not of government, but we are part of the sort of civil discussion in other in the state and in the country. So that's how I like to think of us, as a civil society group. So the coming up, we have a couple of events. There is an event on Sunday. The Resist Hate group meets. They asked me to lead a breakout session, so I'm going to be talking again about our work at Common Cause. There are it's from 2 to 4 on Sunday at Nathan Bishop Middle School. And you can essentially shop groups. The ACLU will be there, a bunch of other groups will be there, and you can spend 20 minutes with any of these about 20 groups talking to us, and then you move on to another group and you can do 3 slots. So that's Sunday, Nathan and Bishop Middle School in Providence, 2 to 4. In July 18th, we don't have the location pinned down yet, we do kind of a legislative wrap-up event. where we explain the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happened this session from our perspective. And then we just have an ongoing calendar of events. Oh, a fun one. June 2nd, we're gonna have a 1 mile fun run up in Central Falls because the census test is happening. We didn't even
Right.
talk about that. Only place in the United States where they're actually testing the census to see if the methods work is in Providence County. And to raise some awareness of it, we're gonna have a little run called the Test Run in Central Falls on June 2nd. So we're doing all sorts of things out there. So you can find us, we put it all on the social media, we put it on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find us there.
Excellent. John Marion, Common
Great.
Cause,
Thank you
Executive
very much.
Director. Thank you so much for spending the entire evening here.
Absolutely.
Hope you had fun, and this is, I'm gonna put this right next to my, why you should support Common Cause, and because we'd be a far poorer state without you. And the yeoman-like work that happens, again, you go up to, my words, Mordor, on any given evening, and it's not the grand dramatic moments that shape and form the government we all live with. It's the quiet negotiations, we like to say, the coalition in the halls of justice. Justice is often in the halls, and it's the nuances of public testimony that take place. If many people don't have a lifestyle or the bandwidth, as we say now in the new millennium, to engage in that themselves, we are blessed in this state to have a handful of organizations that are doing it with your best interests at heart. It's a double-edged sword. If your reflections and your support are important, not just to continue the mission, but also, quite frankly, because I found your organization to be very open to input from people who want to get involved. And at the same token, you can't expect your voice to be heard if you either won't yourself or support those who would do it for you. And it's really that simple, isn't it?
Yep, no, and you know, if you don't get involved with us, get involved with some group. It's probably not my own self-interest to say that, but you know, our democracy depends on people engaging it. And
Right.
yes, it's important to vote, and we do everything we can to make voting accessible. But it's about more than voting. It's about what happens in between elections too. And you need to engage in your community all the time if you can.
Thanks very much.
Yep,
We're
absolutely.
gonna take a very quick break, and then I'm gonna spend about 5 minutes or so talking to the camera directly. I think we've just about out of time for the evening. But again, we are the coalition. We are, as always, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition of Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Darkness has descended upon Providence, which means the fun must begin. Folks, if you don't stay home tonight, head out, whether it be in Cumberland, CF, down in South County, go out and support local businesses, local entertainment venues, have some fun, keep the love alive. That is in fact Rhode Island. Tonight we've seen two folks who epitomize the hashtag, if you will, of the coalition. They take it very, very personally. And to them, I thank them for tonight and their continuing efforts on our behalf. I'll see you up at Halitosis Hall.
Very good.
Stay tuned, we'll be right back. And we're back. Just a couple of minutes left. Kind of an interesting evening. Some events that are coming up. John Marion mentioned some of the legislative issues coming up. Monday night, if you're interested in interfacing with the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island, we will be at Tickets in Middletown, Rhode Island from 7 till, well, whenever they throw us out. We'll be talking about the Second Amendment. Talking about it in a mature yet aggressive mode, in the sense that we'll be discussing not emotional responses, but actually the underlying facts, the causes, the issues surrounding it. Today, of course, was a very difficult day, again in this nation, where you had yet another attack at a school, again by obviously a troubled student. We'll be handling the issue sensitively in light of that. In the coming weeks, of course, Pride is coming to Rhode Island. The Libertarian Party will be, in fact, involved in that as well, and we invite you to join us to march if you'd like to. Daryl Gould is our new outreach chairman. He can be found at lpri.us. Just, there's a number of tabs there that you can click on to find out more information about our organization and where we stand on issues like we discussed tonight, civil liberties, the role of government in healthcare. We invite you to join us. We do believe that we provide a viable, philosophically sound way for this state to move forward. And what we mean by that is that through free markets, through the free exchange of people, ideas, and commerce, that we believe as an organization that we offer really a road forward. What are my left of center friends, the path forward? We offer the path forward for Rhode Island in terms of addressing some of the issues that we touched on tonight. So, next week, we've got another challenging lineup coming up. We're going to be discussing the 38 Studios Coalition again in the information release as a result of that. We're also going to be diving back into some of the sexual politics revolving around FOSTA and SESTA and issues that we had touched on just a month or two ago, because post-legislation, FOSTA and SESTA, we're starting to see the results, and it's not good. So next week, we're going to be doing a tremendous amount of follow-up on some of the stories that we covered in the past month. We're also going to touch base with the folks regarding Invenergy. This week, a law was passed to adjust the board that oversees these mega energy development, the siting board. And we'll be discussing that. I'm going to try and get Paul Roselli in. So folks, thank you for joining me tonight. We are the Coalition, loud and proud. As always, we are outrage porn free. I would ask you, if you can go to coalitionradio.us, click on our YouTube page. Can you please subscribe to our page? As an independent media outlet, it's very important to us that our metrics are affected by, well, the level of perceived support from the community. That gets us more into circulation. It helps us as an organization. If you're looking to sponsor the show, tonight was intense. We didn't have a chance really to discuss our sponsors outside of the image you saw behind us, but we've got some wonderful sponsors. Yacht Club Soda, Rhode Island's iconic boutique soda. YachtClubBottlingWorks.com. Air Sciences at airscience.net. Daryl Gould and his hardy crew providing biological and mold remediation of biohazards both in the home, at schools, and at businesses. News was filled today with yet another outbreak of the norovirus in a school undergoing a deep cleaning. Might be a great idea this spring to go to airsciences.net, reach out to Daryl and John Fennessy, and talk about doing it, well, quite frankly, before folks get sick. It's not a bad part of your regimen to give your business that sort of deep cleaning every year as a harbinger of spring. And of course, Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. Imagine the ability to ship your vehicle with worldwide reach from a company based right here locally in Warwick, Rhode Island. BeaconShippingLogistics.com, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT, whether it be that vehicle that you purchase online, or maybe you're sending a vehicle out to your kiddo at school. Maybe you actually have sold a vehicle to someone. Don't rely on your valuable assets on strangers. Eric and his crew at BeaconShippingLogistics.com give you worldwide reach. They're used extensively by automobile sales professionals, dealerships, manufacturers, OEMs, specialty manufacturers. If they're using them, you should too. So a big thank you to the folks who sponsor this show, with which this show simply would cease to exist. And while we don't pretend to be the answer for all the things that ill the United States or Rhode Island in particular, we do believe we provide an effective forum for the presentation of issues, type of in-depth conversation tonight that you saw. Mr. Marion being able to spend an hour and a half getting into the weeds, deep analysis of the issues and the missions of Common Cause and the challenges and ethics issues that we face as good government groups here in Rhode Island today. That would not exist without the sponsors who support our programming. So coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/coalitionradio, and of course the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. Word has it that in the coming week or two, we might be seeing yet another attempt by your Pawtucket Red Sox, Billionaire Baseball Boys Club, at going after the golden ring again. We'll be there to answer the bell. And of course, follow us on our specialized anti-Billionaire Baseball Boys Club Twitter feed at Pawtucket is Home. Folks, have a great week.